Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video I'll be talking about my thoughts on the latest season of Survivor 43, a season that has been surrounded by some negativity from the online community, with the season feeling like the final straw for people with the issues of the new era, and mixing that in with some worrying trends in the boot order. It did lead to a lot of vocal frustration over this season, which I do fully understand and do share a lot of those same criticisms, though I still had fun with this season despite that, where despite my issues with the format of the new era, this season did feel like a more refined version of seasons 41 and 42, with them clearly learning some lessons from that first cycle, and they're improving upon the game structure, though again, this season does still exemplify all of the issues I have with modern Survivor. This advantage-heavy focus, the muddled editing at points, the lack of true villainous figures, the now mundane 3-tribe format, but also ends up highlighting certain other issues that I didn't recognize until this season, which we will obviously talk about. But these issues still weren't enough for me to outright dislike this season. To me, it is in line with these other seasons of the new era, all having their own pros and cons, and 43 doesn't do much to exceed those seasons, but doesn't feel like a dip in quality either. But like my other reviews, to run through my thoughts on the season, we'll be talking about the season from beginning to end. So let's start off with the premiere, which ends up being another 2-hour premiere, but surprisingly here it ends with only one elimination, in contrast to 41 and 42, which allows us to not have a non-elimination down the road, which I think is always a good thing. And I do like having a 2-hour premiere here. It does allow us to get to know the cast, and really this entire season ends up giving us a really balanced edit, to where even by the end of this first episode here, I do feel like we have a pretty solid grasp on the entire cast here, with literally everyone getting confessional along the way. But really as a whole, while again there are adjustments to the 41-42 format for this season still largely feels very similar, with so many seemingly insignificant format changes that were made for those seasons continuing here. Though thankfully they do get rid of the worst culprits of the bunch in the Hourglass and the Do or Die, which while I still don't think this format is great, again, it does feel like a slightly refined version of the format we had seen in the previous seasons. I think those changes make this format feel a bit more tolerable. But starting off with the season, we have players riding on boats as we get introduced to the cast, with them talking about their backstories, where we see the likes of Ryan getting to talk about overcoming cerebral palsy, Nneka talks about her struggles growing up in Nigeria, Noelle talks about having lost her leg and overcoming that to become a Paralympian, and realistically, despite these being the first 3 introduced here, they are all relatively minor characters on this season, and end up fitting in with the criticism that I felt like this season seemed to get a lot more than previous ones, with people being upset at casting for casting people just for their sob stories, then continuously showing these players' backgrounds across the season, which I get where this criticism came from. However, I feel like a lot of the blame is being put on casting, which I don't agree with. Where here, I don't feel like it's the players or the casting that has significantly changed. It's more so how the producers are portraying these players in the edit that has changed. It's not that they're casting people with more sob stories nowadays. It's simply the fact that they're deciding to show these players' backgrounds and allowing them to talk about their stories. And along with that comes this inherent positivity while doing so. Again, comparing the likes of Noelle to the likes of Kelly Bruno is really night and day when you're looking at their edits, despite having similar backgrounds, and it really is the way that production decided to portray them that makes Noelle feel like she's lumped in with this sentiment. I think this all just comes down to production's philosophy in the modern day, and how they want to edit people as if they are actual people and not as characters on the show. And again, despite all this backlash against the casting of this season, I still stand by the fact that I do think casting is in the best state it has ever been for Survivor. I just feel like the utilization of this cast can come off as underwhelming here. But following those initial sentimental confessionals, we are then followed up by some pretty fun ones. We get decent confessionals from the likes of Mariah and James, who come off as fun characters. We get some fun editing tricks from Sammy, talking about all of his jobs and them adding them to his Chiron as he says them. We have Owen talking about having always dreamt of being on Survivor and having his name in the opening credits, to where we actually see them edit together a credit segment for him. We do also get short confessionals from Cassidy and Ellie, Ellie's of which being this random confessional about her being a psychologist that I still don't understand why this was used in the trailer, considering how mundane of a confessional it is, which did play a factor into me picking her as my winner pick, which obviously I was wrong, though she obviously ends up getting a pretty big premiere here. Though really, I feel like a lot of these opening confessionals didn't feel that integral to this season's storylines, where, for example, we get a major focus here on Lindsay, who ends up getting some really strong personal content talking about her being a fan of the show and how much Survivor means to her, and talks about her family, how they watch the show together. And again, all this content, along with her later strategic content, really made her a top contender for me after the premiere, and I was expecting her to at least have an extremely deep run on the season, be a big character for a season, but that all really just goes nowhere. But really, two of the biggest characters on the season do get introduced here. First of which being Carla, who instantly gets a mix of personal and game content, to where this dichotomy ends up leading to her being a top contender for the Edge community. But also, we do get introduced to Cody, where he talks about playing hard and fast, just like his life, and talks about needing to win as he has already spent part of the money, which, considering how over the top of a character Cody can be, I do think this confessional gives us an insight into who he is as a person, connecting this back to his personal life. But then we get back to Shore, where Jeff still comes off as his happy-go-lucky self that we saw in 41 and 42, though throughout the course of this season, we do thankfully see glimpses of dickish Jeff coming back at points. Though his spiel here in particular did really annoy me, and really does exemplify my issues with Modern Survivor, where Jeff talks about how this is an adventure and that if you let go of expectations and give yourself permission to play it, it'll change your life, and that he hopes Survivor gives you what you seek. And really, I just want to say, shut up, Jeff. Again, I really just hate this entire framing of the game of Survivor as this metaphor for life. It's so grating to me. And again, I think part of this is me being scarred from American Ninja Warrior, and that being the approach that show has taken over time, to where I do worry that Survivor might be in a similar trajectory, though I don't think it's gotten to the point yet to where it's detrimental to the show. Here we also get more Matt chat, mostly talking about their fandom of the show, which also the fact that most of the cast are super fans is also a common criticism you hear nowadays, lowering the amount of drama and increasing the game bodiness of the season, which I can understand to a degree, but really I feel like having a cast of recruits isn't a solution either. I think the era of reality TV that we're currently in is one where people are just hyper aware of the fact that they are simply on a game show, considering that recruits would just end up watching other recent Survivor seasons anyway. I do feel like you might as well go all in on having these big fans of the show, and in turn potentially evolve the game instead of trying to cast people who don't know the game in the hopes that there's chaotic gameplay there, as in reality I do think most of the times it would just lead to stagnation. Really, I just feel like this is the evolution of Survivor, to have this very game-focused product at this point. And really, I feel like my criticisms of the season actually come from the fact that they don't focus on the game enough and end up wasting too much time on more superfluous content. But here we do get an introduction to Janine for what is her only personal content across this entire season, talking about her watching the show for Dad. James talks about getting into the show due to watching Earl Cole, which, mind-blowing, we're getting an Earl Cole reference on the main show in 2022. But also here we get time number 2 of Noelle talking about losing her leg. That is used as an inspirational moment here, which again is most of our content on this season. Then we get to the first reward challenge, which is a pretty similar challenge to that of Survivor 42, just without the amulet being involved. And again, pretty standard challenge. Nothing super notable here until the very end, where we do see Coco in the lead on the final part of grabbing the flint with a pole, to which Lindsay ends up losing it for Coco, which following this she does talk about this being a wake-up call that again you would think would lead to her developing over the course of the season, but no, it doesn't. But the challenge does end with a pretty savvy move from Cody of him breaking the challenge here, of realizing that you can use the hole in the pole to secure the flints, winning the challenge for Vessi, and instantly showing Cody off as not this simple-minded guy that, to be fair, I fully expected him to be coming into this season. But then we finally get to the camps, where again, similar to 41 and 42, we do get the return of the losing tribes having to earn their flint through the return of Savvy or Sweats, which again, I was floored seeing this come back. I mean, it's fine. It's mostly inoffensive, though again, does feel like a lot of just wasted time on the show. But the concept of this returning was literally a thought I never had before. Though again, I do think this modern trope of the players having to earn everything is something I just find really boring. Again, a waste of time. Feels like a consequence of the 26-day format, with production feeling the need to vindicate this version of Survivor as being just as hard as the 39 format, which obviously it isn't, but also, I don't care. I feel like all this does is further exhaust the players, which can minimize the energy they have to play the game, which in turn seems to contradict the game-heavy persona that the show tries to exude. Now, the actual tasks here end up being pretty boring, but they are used pretty effectively to further develop the players involved in them. Where on Coco, we do see Ryan and Gio volunteer to do Sweats, where Ryan ends up finding the flint early on, and this ends up leading to this really OTT backstory segment of him once again talking about his cerebral palsy, which again is an inspirational story, and I as a whole do like the inclusion of these player backstories, but I did feel like in this season in particular, it did feel like they just ended up becoming extremely repetitive on this season, with them using the same ones over and over again, but just expanding upon them each time. And also considering the fact that for someone like Ryan in particular here, that this is a good chunk of his content in the early portion of the season, it did make the major focus that was put on him here feel kind of pointless. But then on Baka, we do see them do Savvy, and this ends up being a pretty strong moment for Sammy here, with him being the one to solve the puzzle for the group, to which he gets largely conflicting content there, where this is portrayed as, oh, Sammy is smarter than what he lets on, showing him as the smartest guy there despite only being 19, and he does constantly talk about wanting to be the youngest to win the game, and this was solid content, though it does directly conflict with what he was saying earlier in the scene about how he doesn't want people to think of him as smart, and he's going to play into his physical strength, though he also later gets positive content surrounding him being the one to make fire. So again, all this makes him a pretty mixed figure after this premiere. But also on Baka, we do get a lot of focus around Gabler here, who gets a bit of a dodo edit across this premiere, with him being shown to make strategic errors later in the episode, and also ends up leading the shelter building only for him to be undermined by his other tribe mates. Though he does still get decent personal content along the way, with his constant talk about being the oldest guy out there and needing to be cautious about how he approaches the game, which does show some method to his madness. And we do see him reaching out to Ellie to where they bond over metal music, which continues this dodo edit for Gabler, with Ellie revealing that she doesn't actually like metal music. Though really this Gabler-Ellie dynamic on this season ends up being a really fun rivalry, especially considering its really positive start in the premiere here. Ellie ends up being shown as the mastermind of this episode, being overly exposed from the very beginning here in a way that very much reminded me of Evie from 41, and really her trajectory here ends up being relatively similar to that of them seemingly running the game early on, though major red flags come up along the way, only for them to be put on the bottom immediately after the merge. But along with that here, Ellie also gets a decent amount of personal content, with her revealing that her sister had died of a drug overdose, and this ends up being a really sympathetic moment for Ellie here, again in this position where she could have easily been portrayed as just a straight up villain, but they end up humanizing her a bit more here, and she ends up revealing this to the other women, to which this ends up bonding them even more, setting up this all women's alliance that doesn't end up holding. But also here we get a lot of content from Owen, where he is portrayed in a pretty interesting way, where the alliance building and overall activeness on the gameplay on this tribe seem to be much lower than that of the other tribes, and Owen ends up being the one to vocalize this on the show, talking about his frustrations with the tribe and talking about how they're not playing the game. And he ends this segment with him saying that the passiveness of the tribe will end up biting him in the butt, which we do end up seeing come to roost. So the fact that Owen was proven right here ends up being something that kept his winning chances alive for me, despite his content being pretty middling moving forward. Now let's move on to Coco, where like on Baka, we do see the formation of an all-women's alliance. Again, kind of ironic how focused they are in this premiere, considering the noted poor performance of women across this season. But it does start with a pretty decent focus on Cassidy, with her getting a lot of content talking about playing a sneaky and aggressive game that, along with her talking about playing behind the scenes so that she's not a threat, it does leave open the potential for her getting this Erika style of edit that coming into her merge. Again, I had her at the top of my mid-season power rankings, even though at the time of the premiere here, I didn't think it was that likely to happen. But here we do see Lindsay be the one to organize the women together and also ends up pulling James into the alliance, which this strangely gets set up as a duo here, only for it to essentially amount to nothing. So really, again, I just don't get what they were doing with Lindsay's edit in a way that very much reminded me of what happened with Tiffany in Survivor 41, with there being so many through lines getting set up with her, only for them to all go nowhere. But James's intro here ends up being a pretty interesting one to me as well, where James again already had gotten solid content up until this point, but here we also get this backstory of him being a chess champion, and along with that comes a really great quote that I thought at the time could be setting up a winning trajectory for him, where he talks about how he is the king but wants to look like a pawn, which felt like this season's version of Erika's lamb into a lion quote, but instead of propelling his edit moving forward, it ends up actually being used to undermine him, with his theme being constantly contradicted later on. After this episode, I did look at James as the top contender, but also here we do get a lot of content focusing around Karla, who again was looked at as an Edgic frontrunner for most of the season, and she ends up being set up as the swing vote here, getting this mastermind edit, and her obviously having the all-women's alliance, but also was shown to have a relationship with Gio, to which they bond over being LGBT and their Hispanic background, and Gio gets some nice personal content here, though that content felt eerily similar to what we had already gotten from Romeo in the previous season, with Karla kind of being the high in this relationship, but it does end up setting her up to be in the middle of the tribe moving forward. Well, also here we also get the setup of her arc of her lacking confidence, which strangely finds a resolution by episode 3, which again just feels strangely put together here. But finally, let's jump over to Vessi, where right away we get the dynamics of this tribe getting shown to us, with Noelle and Justine seeming to instantly bond, with Justine getting a decent chunk of content here, having her storyline revolving around her being the one to start the fire, to which we get this humorous scene of their shelter collapsing just as she makes the fire, only for the fire to go out as well immediately after that. Also through this episode, I already pegged Justine as the boot for the following round, with this episode being really heavy-handed in how it's setting up her boot for down the road, leading us to Cody, who ends up being a major character here, talking about setting the tone, and instantly we see him make a 3-person alliance with Jesse and Nneka, with the intention of targeting Justine, saying that she is a salesperson and salespeople are not to be trusted, so that's why he needs to target her, only for us to get the reveal that Cody himself is also in sales, which ends up being a fun little storyline here, but is also followed up with Cody revealing that he has a life motto, in that being livin', which he has tattooed on his butt cheek, which this motto ends up really playing into the overall themes of his story. But this talk about tattoos here also ends up leading to us seeing the foundation of the Cody-Jesse duo, who do make an impressive run moving forward, and Jesse ends up taking Karla's role on this tribe, being set up as the person in the middle, clearly more loyal to Cody and Nneka, though at the same time builds a relationship with Justine and Noelle, to where he is talked about as the swing. But interestingly here, he ends up being one of the last players in the premiere here to get introduced, being a major red flag for his edit, but his content here is still pretty strong, talking about his gang background and how he turned that all around to get a PhD in political science, which again is a fantastic story. But to me, it always came off as a decoy winner edit, even more blatantly so than Karla's. But then we finally get to what I guess is another tradition in the new era, especially for the premiere, in that we do get the journey, where each tribe has to send one player, which interestingly leads to Coco and Baka both leaving it up to chance, where Karla and Gabler win their respective games. And really this all seemed to stem from the fact of no one wanting to put a target on their backs, which leads to us seeing on Vessi Dwight volunteering to go, and in turn putting a target on his back. And Dwight does get a decently big edit in this premiere, despite him fading into the background afterwards, making all this focus on him feel very circumstantial, but even then his content here wasn't even that good, as it consistently undermines him, with him being shown to have made a bad move here, and despite him getting decent personal content about his fandom of the show, he does largely get this fish out of the water edit that we see from the likes of like a Stephen Fishback in Cambodia or a John Cochran. But following this, the three end up arriving at the summit, with again it playing out similar to Shipwheel Island from the previous 2 seasons, with them taking a track that leads up to a decision. And on the track, we do get more personal content for Carla, with her talking about her poor upbringing and overcoming that. She ends up talking about how she has both street and book smarts, all good content for her, and coming off at a similar time to Marianne's content from 42, which was all a pretty good sign. But this is also matched with content of her talking about needing to calm herself down, and she ends up being the only player here to not risk, continuing this arc of her lack of confidence that again, she later shows growth from this, but this did come off as very journey-y to me. In previous seasons, players who do have their edits focused around their development as people typically don't end up winning their seasons, and while we are in this era of the show where the show wants everyone to undergo a journey, it did feel like another red flag for me and what I was already seeing as a decoy edit at this point. But again, the decision ends up being very similar to Shipwheel Island of risking or not risking your vote in order to get an advantage, though I did like a major change made here in that the players are making this decision while still together, and in turn are able to see who risks and who doesn't, and those that risk find out whether or not they lose their votes when they get back to camp, being an integral change here that makes all this a lot more fair, allowing for the players to plan accordingly, which I do think is a change for the better. But here we do see Gabler and Dwight risk their votes, with Dwight ending up losing his vote, to where on his return to camp, he is open about what happened, as, I mean, really you have to be, considering everyone had already seen 41 and in turn knew what they were doing. But here we see Cody not trusting his story, setting up this rivalry between the two, that when people say by the time the Dwight boot that they're confused over why Cody would want Dwight out, I mean, it's literally set up here from the very beginning. But in turn, we do see Gabler winning the advantage, which ends up being an idol that is good for 2 tribals, which, again, I don't mind timed idols, though this one in particular doesn't end up getting used, though it does end up being a major source of drama on Baka moving forward. But then we get to the immunity challenge, which Jeff Funley calls a kick-ass challenge, despite the fact that it's really just an extremely generic one, though we do get some fun from Gabler and Sammy bickering during the table maze, to which Baka ends up losing the challenge, being the only time Baka goes to tribal, and here we instantly see Gabler taking accountability for their loss and gives a speech about not wanting to take the easy way out, and openly says that he will be using his shot in the dark that night instead of his idol. And this is portrayed as this ridiculous move, and to be fair for Gabler, I do think it was a mostly emotional move. But I do think in retrospect, I don't think it's a move without merit. I mean, if everyone already knows that you have an idol and now also think that you might play your shot in the dark, it's extremely unlikely that anyone is going to vote for you, considering you're pretty much double protected at that point. And we do see this lead to everyone being scared to vote for Gabler. So really, I do think this is actually a good move, but obviously just not an intentional one from Gabler. But this is followed by Ellie, again, taking the forefront with her talking Gabler down from this plan, and ends up talking about needing physical strength for challenges, and creates the plan to take out Mariah. Which here we don't get much context on why it is Mariah being targeted here, especially with this all-women's group being a focus early on. Though following Ellie's logic here, again, she is essentially picking between Janine and Mariah as those considered to be physical weaknesses, and obviously she is much closer to Janine. And really, Janine seemed to be more involved within the tribe dynamics anyway, to where Mariah didn't seem to branch out much beyond her all-women group, which I do think factored into her being the boot here. But again, this does start this trend of women going out in a row, which becomes a major source of controversy for this season. I do think much of the reason why she gets voted out here does make this trend look even worse, but I do think most of these boots were situational, though I do think the format has greatly factored into making this more likely, where with smaller tribes, there's this general assumption that you're going to need physical strength, but also mixing that with the acknowledgement that there aren't swaps in recent seasons, and also the increased focus on needing to earn your supplies and needing to forage your own food. I do think all these factors stereotypically benefit men and in turn disfavor women. Though again, I think in reality this was just a freak case that I don't think necessitates any immediate changes, though obviously if this trend continues beyond this season, then some action would need to be taken. Though here we do end up seeing Owen being set up as the red herring, with Mariah and Sammy talking about him being a threat down the road, which one shows you how well positioned in the game Sammy is at this point, with him seeming to be the guy most aligned with the women, and supposedly even further down the road, Janine and Ellie were more loyal to Sammy than to Owen. But also, this ends up being set up of Owen being a threat, which did feel very Marianne-esque, though really this didn't end up being as integral of a part to Baka's story. But here we do end up seeing Ellie going to Janine and telling her about Mariah being the target, which Janine is clearly not on board with and tries to convince Ellie back around, though obviously ends up failing. And really, this is terrible content for the both of them. And collectively, this felt like set up to their eventual downfalls, with them eventually being taken out before the men of their tribe, but also as individuals for Ellie, for her to turn her back against the women's group, despite her saying that these were the people she trusted earlier on in the episode. It's pretty bad for her, but also for Janine, this is bad considering this is literally her only content on this entire episode. The only confessional she gets of this entire episode is her talking about wanting to save Mariah, which she obviously ends up failing to do. And with that, and the fact that she also has no setup storyline for her, it made me never even contemplate a possible Janine win, even when she became a more prominent figure later on. And really all the support towards Janine as a potential winner always seemed to be misguided to me. But finally we get to Tribal, which I will say normally I do find Tribal deliberations pretty mundane, but for some reason this season's in particular really irked me, and most of them just feeling like pointless dribble and acted as propaganda about how great Modern Survivor is, when again it's like, who cares, and just felt like a waste of time on the show, especially when the show itself doesn't even properly explain many of the votes moving forward, to where this felt like time they could have used to do so instead of wasting all this time in Tribal. Though I will say that this Tribal in particular did have a couple humorous moments, with the return of Dick Jeff, with him being incensed at Gabler saying that they were supposed to win, and being upset at Mariah saying that they did win because at least they tried. And this was fun to see old school Jeff come out here. And what made it even funnier is that they seemed to mess up the lighting on Jeff to where he looked extremely washed out during this scene as well. But again, all this just leads up to a predictable Mariah vote, and Mariah was someone that I was fully expecting to be a big character coming into this season, as she did get a pretty fun intro, but then it just leads to her being relatively quiet for the rest of the episode. And really that goes for most of the early boots on this season, where the season did seem to focus a lot more on the players that did make deeper runs, leaving the pre-mergers as the most underdeveloped figures on this season. And Mariah in particular here, considering she was the first boot, really didn't get much to do, but also I don't really have a major issue with that, considering again I think it props up this cast, allows us to get to know more of the people that will have more of an influence on this season moving forward. And realistically, while Mariah always seemed like a fun presence, I never thought she had much game potential, or even in the preseason she was talking about remaining loyal, or James Clement and saying never bite the apple, which again is just not the way that you would approach Modern Survivor, so her being an early boot really did not surprise me. But then we finally get to episode 2, which ends up being a 90-minute episode, and I've said this before, that I do think there could be an element of them testing out the waters for 90-minute Survivor episodes for the future, but it also could just be the fact that Real Love Boat wasn't ready in time. But this decision to make this episode 90 minutes was clearly something decided post-filming, as this episode really doesn't have anything in it that necessitates its length, though considering it is only the second episode, it does allow the cast to be fully established really early on. But first let's talk about Baka, who do get a lot of focus around how rough the conditions are, leading to Gabler seeming to run out of steam, feeling like an out of place moment, with this seeming to set up a potential Gabler medevac, or him potentially wanting to quit, though that doesn't really matter as he's pretty much fine by the following episode. Now Owen also gets a decent chunk of content, but it is content that seems to contrast with his more strategic content that he was given in the previous episode, with him now being presented in more of a wacky way, with him getting water, calling himself a junior deputy water boy, seems spilling water on his way back to camp and complaining along the way, which again, all this is a fun scene, but this is followed by him continuously getting undermined across this episode, where following this we do see the dynamics of the tribe be defined a bit more, where we see Ellie and Janine being portrayed as this solidified duo that think they're running the game, talking about how they can choose between Owen or Sammy as their third, leading to a notable confessional from Ellie, talking about her looking at them as her children and Sammy being the independent one while Owen is the one that needs more attention, which again undermines Owen but also props up Sammy here, who starts to get an interesting edit from this point forward, being shown as this foil to Ellie and Janine, both of which getting these villainous edits at this point, while Sammy is the one working behind the scenes to undercut them by getting the guys together and working effectively and turning Gabler against them, fitting into his storyline about being underestimated and proving people wrong, which made him a top contender for me at this point in the season. Now, also due to the expanded episode length, we do also strangely get content from Baka after they win the immunity challenge, which does end up being positive content for Ellie, talking about proving herself for solving the puzzle for the tribe, and talks about having ADHD and dyslexia and having overcome her childhood fears, which again is nice content for her and clearly a type of content that Survivor just loves, so I think this would have found its way into the edit either way. Though this is where we do get the fundamentals of the later Ellie-Gabler rivalry, with her mocking his fishing ability and now plans on voting him out, but wants clarification on the rules of his idol, not knowing if it is still valid, finally showing the players themselves confused over these modern day advantages, though Janine here ends up searching through his bag to find out that his idol is still valid for the next tribal that he attends, and this ends up being the basis around Baka's storyline moving forward. Now, Coco is barely present in this episode, where almost all of their content revolves around Ryan and Gio, with Gio getting to further explore his backstory, which again is nice, but again does feel repetitive considering we got most of the same content in the previous episode, which again is still a noticeable trend. And again, I do think it led to some more sour opinions on these segments, where I don't dislike them conceptually, but the utilization of them on this season did feel a bit overkill. And it's also strange for Ryan and Gio to be getting this glowing edit here, only for them to be villainized in the upcoming episodes, again feeling like it is conflicting with this modern approach to editing, though Carla does also get to talk about this relationship as a threat to her, showing us her perspective without overexposing her, continuing her solid edit here. But most of the episode does revolve around Vesey, even before the immunity challenge, where we do see more of Dwight with him getting his backstory, but also see him finally get added to the tribe dynamics after being pretty much completely left out of them in the previous episode, where we do establish his duo with Jesse, with them being talked about as island spouses, and this ends up being a strange dynamic on this season considering they're portrayed as being in the middle of the tribe here, despite the fact that Jesse was clearly always more loyal to Cody than he was to Dwight and had a vested interest the entire time that was directly opposed to what Dwight's was, with Dwight targeting Cody at this point in the game and being more aligned with Justine and Noelle. And considering Dwight's later downfall as well, I just feel like this entire dynamic is one that feels very underdeveloped for those later events, while also being shown as more important than it really was at this point in the game. Especially with Dwight not having a vote in this situation, making his role in this episode pretty irrelevant, but also just making me pretty confused over how they decided to edit this dynamic on their show, considering this dynamic was dropped at the point where it was probably the most integral to the season. Also here we do further establish the Jesse-Cody relationship, with Jesse really propping up Cody and his social game, where we later see Cody having a genuine conversation with Noelle, wanting to learn about her struggles, and this leads to us getting more of Cody's backstory, talking about a friend of his in high school who had died, and that motivated him to change his life and motivated him to take risks, playing into his story from episode 1 and fully fleshing out his live-in motto, which perfectly rounds out his character in his arc in a way that felt very winnery to me, where again he has this consistent thematic storyline which had been a trend for the winners of the modern era. And Cody's edit at this point felt the most in line with that thought, though also with this positive content also comes some red flags in this episode, where it does end up showing his risk-taking as something that potentially backfires on him later on, and it also does leave him very overexposed, with him ending this episode breaking Evie's record from 41 of having the most confessionals after episode 2, though obviously the longer runtime of episode 2 did play a factor into that. But then we get to the immunity challenge, which during it we do get a lot of focus around Nicka's poor performance, with her struggling physically and also her losing a puzzle piece, which ends up losing them the challenge, and making her a target coming into the vote, though obviously through her connections to Cody and Jesse, they were clearly going to protect her here. And again, without Dwight having a vote, this should have been a clear 3-2 vote, and with the Justine setup from the previous episode, this could have just been a very simple, boring vote off, but we still end up getting some intrigue along the way. We do get some focus on Justine with her getting a bit of a dodo edit, Jesse talking about his annoyances with her. We also see some pretty poor play from her as well, with her making it abundantly clear to Nicka that she is voting her out, and we also see her in a position where she knows that Jesse is the swing and ends up vocalizing her distrust to him, which is just kind of insane. Now, do I think this ultimately played a factor? No, I think she was probably going home anyway, but this was pretty poor play here. So again, Jesse's vote for me was never in doubt, but he does end up trying to get Dwight to get on board, but ends up being unsuccessful, which I will say in turn, while I do think Justine played this round pretty poorly, I do think she ends up being partially screwed over by the fact that Dwight lost his vote, as that would have gotten them to a tie theoretically, though considering they do end up splitting the vote, again, whether or not it would have mattered is a bit questionable, but she still did have Dwight on her side. But Justine clearly looks to be on her way out until we get a wrinkle in the plan, which ends up being the bulk of Cody's content in this episode, where he ends up finding the Beware advantage and decides to open it despite the risks, again playing into his theme, but putting the entire plan into danger to a degree. Now again, they did split the vote to where this actually wouldn't have mattered if Cody had lost his vote here, as it still would have been a 2-1-1, but the show acts as if it matters here, and it is still portrayed as a careless move. But we do find out here that the Beware task for the season is that you have to collect specific beads from each player on the tribe through social means, being an interesting modification of the Beware advantages from last season, making it less public than the phrases. So again, that's a plus, especially with the later knowledge power advantage being in the game still. But also it tests social ability to a degree, which adds this heist-like segment to the show that can be fun, though considering we see the same task for all three tribes, it does get repetitive after its first appearance, though realistically, I also feel like this task's difficulty gets a bit overblown in the edit, where every time we see it, we get this trope of one player in particular liking a specific bead and not wanting to give it up, as here we see Noelle with that, but really it's like, who cares? Like, if you're a player in the game and someone is really insistent in wanting your bead, are you really going to risk harming your relationship with that said person if they are insistent in wanting it, especially when the rest of the tribe had also given their beads? I mean, to me, it's like this entire concept is not as impressive as what the show portrays it as, though, again, it is still a fun segment where Cody recruits Jesse and Nicka to help him get beads from the others, with them creating a storyline of him wanting to decorate his palm frond hat, and despite them not showing him complete it by the time of Tribal, I knew exactly what they were doing here and saving it for a flashback during the vote. And we do see the votes come up, and as the sighting vote gets revealed, we flash back to Cody getting the bead from Noelle, because obviously, though again, like Justine would have gone home anyway here, but that really just made it even more apparent that Cody was going to be successful, as Wyvern set this up as a potential foil to the plan if it wasn't. And I do like these style of editing tricks, though I do feel like this one largely came off as pretty ineffective to me. But again, we do end up losing Justine here, who I think is a person that as time goes on will probably be one of the more forgotten figures from this season, where outside of her questionable play with Jesse and her being targeted for being in sales, she really just didn't make that much of an impact on this season. Yeah, I do think she is largely a middling player, one that we saw make a number of mistakes, though it did seem solid socially to have exactly half of the tribe on her side, though I don't think she was all there strategically to boon off of that, which ends up making her a pretty mediocre player. Then let's jump to episode 3, which ends up being a slower episode in terms of the actual vote off, though I do think we get some intrigue along the way, particularly coming from Baka, where we do follow up on the Gabler storyline, with Ellie continuing to target him. But continuing off the info from the previous episode that his idol is still valid, she now wants to trick Gabler into not using his idol if given the opportunity, by making him think that his idol isn't valid anymore. And this is just a dumb plan. I mean, one, it is insulting Gabler's intelligence for her to think that he doesn't know what his own advantage, but also doing this is very minorly beneficial to her, especially considering it has a very small chance of working anyway. And I get that puts her in a good spot if Gabler goes here, where from her point of view, she thinks both Owen and Sammy are thinking that they are her and Janine's third, but really, we know that isn't true, for Sammy at least, which makes this a bad read from Ellie. But even beyond that, why can't Gabler be in that position as well, considering how close they seem to be at the very beginning? So all of this felt like a massive mishandling of her relationship with Gabler, and it immediately backfires on her here, with Sammy continuing to undermine her by telling Gabler of this plan, making Gabler not trust Ellie moving forward, and really starting the eventual downfall for Ellie in the game. But also providing Sammy with strong content here, continuing this theme of him being underestimated by the women. But Gabler himself also gets positive content here, with him talking about being underestimated, and we do see him feign ignorance in his convo with Ellie, to which it makes it pretty clear that he is going to eventually win this battle. Now in Coco, most of the content does revolve around Carla and the Beware Vantage, though beforehand, we do get a bit of a check-in with Cassidy, where she narrates the opening of this scene, which did start to remind me of the edit of Michelle Fitzgerald in Co Wrong to a degree, starting her more upward trajectory in the edit, but this leads to a montage of everyone looking for an advantage, leading to Carla being the one to find it. But interestingly, we do see her putting it back, not being willing to take the risk here, again playing off of this storyline set up in the premiere, though again strangely we do end up seeing her fully develop over the course of this one episode. And really early on in the season, that sort of dispels the concept that her edit is going to be based around her journey, and usually something that is detrimental to one's edit. So here we do see her return to camp and talk to James, to which he mentions that he would take the risk if he found an advantage, leading to Carla talking about needing to overcome her fears and opening the Beware Vantage, leading to the same task Cody got, and again it being portrayed in a pretty boring way, with this fake out of Ryan not giving his away right away, though obviously she ends up being successful here. And again, I found this scene pretty mundane, but interestingly, Carla ends up being the only one of the Beware Vantage finders to be able to keep theirs a secret. But overall, a really great segment for Carla, again emphasizing why she becomes the Edgic frontrunner of the season. But finally, let's talk about Vesey, where we do see the aftermath of the previous vote, with Dwight being annoyed at Jesse, and Jesse saying that he's ready to sign the divorce papers, which is a fun confessional. But this eventually ends up being the last of the Dwight-Jesse relationship that gets focused on in the edit, which again is something I do think underserves a later plot point. But really, this episode ends up being a massive one for Noelle, with her now being on the bottom of her tribe and later getting an advantage at the summit, and also being the red herring for the eventual vote. But despite that, all of her content here comes off extremely one note, and only felt like it was there because she had to be. Or again, following this episode, she once again falls into the background. Here she gets some of the same personal content once again, talking about her leg, where we literally get it multiple times in this episode, and one of these scenes is literally just a repeat of the confessional from the premiere. But in the immunity challenge, she also has this great moment of her taking off her leg and performing really well in the swimming section, giving her more OTT content there. She again does go on the journey with Owen and James, where we interestingly see them both decide to just give her the advantage after she reveals that she's on the outs, which seemed like a curious choice from James and Owen, especially James considering his constant talk about needing to be willing to take risks, only for him to not do that here, which finally ends up backfiring on him considering Noelle's later use of the vote steal that she ends up getting here. Also, I feel like this concept of pretending to be on the bottom of your tribe in order to get your fellow players to back out of risking their votes could be an emergent strategy moving forward, though technically we do see it fail later in this season. But really, the eventual Nneka boot did feel pretty foreshown, with Nneka once again messing up the puzzle, losing Vesey the immunity challenge, and she does get more personal content here, and her talking about a camp that got burned down in Nigeria that she wants to support, and again, that really kind of just felt like a random scene, but again, clearly this was all meant to give her more content on her way out. And we do see Jesse and Cody obviously struggle with this decision, which ends up being this debate between loyalty and challenge strength, which we literally see them side on the opposite side of this in the previous vote, which I do think the decision to vote out Nneka here ends up being a bit of a questionable one, considering they've already blindsided Noelle and Dwight in the previous vote, though considering the fact that they were able to re-solidify immediately afterwards, and losing Nneka here does actually lead to them winning the remaining immunity challenges. It does lead to it perfectly working out for them anyway, though again was a choice I found questionable at the time. But this is followed by more personal content for Jesse. Here we have him talking about his mom who just passed away, and that voting out Nneka feels like he's voting out his mom, which clearly was going to lead to him voting out Nneka. And I think it becomes even more clear when Noelle doesn't play her vote steal either, and there wasn't any proper setup to her using it. As again, if she was in danger here, this would have been the perfect time to play it, one of the only times you would be able to use this offensively. But strangely, Nneka ends up being blindsided here in a position where you would think she would have known that she was getting voted out. But either way, Nneka is a bit of a strange player on this season, as out of the pre-merge boots here, I actually feel like she does the least wrong, where it does seem like she gets voted out here largely due to her lack of physicality over anything she does wrong strategically or socially. While I don't think that she is that great of a player, I really came into the season expecting her to be the first boot. But considering the fact that she was able to survive a round in which she was actually in the majority for that round, she ends up being better than I expected. Though realistically, I still don't really imagine her winning the game. I feel like no matter what, she would have very low win equity even if she were to get to the end. And really for her role on this season, I just feel like she's another one that will probably be forgotten about down the road, as she really just didn't have that much of an impact on this season, despite the fact that she did get a decent amount of personal content, though even with that she still ends up being relatively underdeveloped here. But now for episode 4, which ends up being a strangely structured episode with the reward challenge and its subsequent reward taking up a bulk of the early portions of the episode, which leads to not much happening back at Bessie and Baka, who do later win the immunity challenge, where on Baka we do just continue to once again see the Ellie-Gabler feud, though here we do get some Dodo content for Gabler with him putting palm fronds on the others in the middle of the night, which obviously ends up annoying them, and we do see this argument between Ellie and Gabler over the fire going out, and this ends up really being a down note for Gabler's edit. Vessie's content outside of the reward ends up being dedicated to showing them as these underdogs and how they're going to make a comeback, and they do end up winning the 2 challenges of this episode, including the reward, which ends up being a tribe raid, a twist that we haven't seen since Survivor Cagayan, and it was fine here. Again, I don't like that it took up so much of the episode, though it does end up providing some decent moments for Cody, who really takes the spotlight here through being the one from Vessie that actually executes the raid. Though strangely, part of this reward is also some raw fish, to which Vessie announces that they want to trade that fish for a previous reward, to which Jeff says that you can always do that. Which, I mean, when did this become a rule? That really came out of nowhere. Again, a nothing format change here. One that is, again, largely inoffensive, but one that just felt very jarring for Jeff to talk about as if it's a rule that everyone knew. But then we get the choice of who to raid, where Baka has fishing gear, which Vessie wants, though they also want to weaken Coco as the tribe that hasn't lost anybody so far. And they do end up deciding to go for Coco, which makes full sense considering their later attempts to work with Baka, but also does come off as very blatant in what they're doing here, though again it doesn't seem to backfire on them. But through this scene, Cody does end up getting some pretty mixed content here, being a bit of a setback in an assumed winner edit of this being a scene where he is clearly being portrayed to not get his way, with him wanting to raid Baka, and also getting talked about as a wild card throughout this scene, with Dwight comparing him to a child sent off to school, which again is not a great look, though at the same time, Jesse does get a confessional talking about how Cody was right, and Cody during the raid does end up doing really well with Coco, caving into his negotiations, and Cody talks about being in the driver's seat and talks about them falling into his trap. So again, this content was really a mixed bag. But again, Coco does end up losing the immunity challenge, which ends up being a really fun challenge with a number of notable moments, from Dwight saying "thank you, Jeffrey," likely a reference to Courtney Yates. We have Gabler yelling out "that's it" during the puzzle and his tribe telling him to shut up. We get Cassidy and Gio weirdly dancing in the sidelines despite their tribe being in last. But really the biggest moment in all this is that we do see Vessie helping out Baka, again being a very blatant move, but one that seemed to have very little effect by the time of the merge. Though after winning, we do end up seeing Ellie kicking the puzzle, clearly a reference to Michelle, and again a lot of fun moments across this challenge, though So with that, we do see Coco going to tribal for the first time, leading to a confessional from Lindsay saying that she will get revenge at the merge, which is weird that this is here considering she ends up going home. Following this, we do get the reinstatement of the initial dynamics, where the majority seems to be the Women's Alliance plus James, though Ryan and Gio think that they have Carla and James on board, where James's involvement of Ryan and Gio really comes out of nowhere here, along with Ryan and Gio's targeting of Cassidy, with this feud between Gio and Cassidy getting a major focus in this episode, with Gio getting a big dodo at it across this episode as well, thinking that he is calling the shots, when in reality he is on his way out at this point. And Cassidy talks about how annoying he is, and Carla explicitly says that he is the easy vote, despite their bonding scene earlier in the season. But this is where the show starts to focus back on Lindsay once again, with her thinking that the Gio vote is seeming too easy, and starts to get paranoid, seeing everyone still talking despite her thinking that the plan is in place, and her gut tells her that she's going to be targeted, especially after her talks with Gio and Ryan don't go well, and this leads to the downfall of her game, where we do see her approaching James and Carla and alerting them to her paranoia, leading to Carla wanting to flip the vote onto Lindsay, now with her being hard to work with. While James ends up struggling with this vote, with him clearly being frustrated over feeling like he has the voter out now, which straight up feels like a very rash move here, but probably one that is the optimal move for Carla, fully putting herself in the middle of the tribe and also reeling in James, with him not having this Lindsay relationship, though again, clearly for James, I do think this is a misstep, though not a detrimental one, as really he still ends up being in the middle of the tribe following this, and there was obviously the potential of him just being on the bottom of that majority alliance anyway, and so I get why he makes the move here, though, considering the choice in the next episode, this allowing this disgruntled Ryan to make the merge, I do think at the end of the day it probably wasn't the ideal move. But also from an edit perspective, I do think a strange aspect of all of this is the fact that James and Carla clearly become the center of this tribe through making this move, and are running this tribe as a duo, though that duo never gets properly set up within the course of the edit, with us instead seeing these other relationships that don't matter as much. This Carla relationship with Gio and this James relationship with Lindsay, which again, the fact that those relationships got focused instead of their actual pairing ends up being a pretty major red flag for me in their edits. Though considering Carla is later the one to take out James, and in a pretty anticlimactic way, I guess it does make sense how they portrayed their relationship here. But straight up, I really thought that the Lindsay boot here was the red herring, with this being one of the few times I'm genuinely surprised by the time the votes are read, where this vote did feel like it was portrayed in a way that a typical easy boot would be portrayed, where the easy boot in Gio was set up earlier only for the red herring to take up a bulk of the rest of the camp segment. However, this time the red herring was the reality, which is also strange considering how openly they talk about Lindsay's paranoia at Tribal as if it's a thing that's come and gone. And really, again, I thought there was no suspense here in that Gio was going home, only for me to be blindsided here, which rarely happens. And again, Lindsay being booted here this early is really strange to me, as it really feels like they edited her as if she was an endgamer, with her getting these storylines that felt like they were set up for down the road, just for that to not happen, and her ending up being sniped out of the game here. And Lindsay does seem like a perfectly capable player, but one that really let her paranoia get a hold of her, especially with her blatantly telling the rest of her alliance how paranoid she is. Though I do think if she were able to take control of her paranoia, I do think there's a good player in her, where she did seem to play the first few rounds pretty well, seemingly being the leader of the majority alliance, though that obviously just crumbles around her here. But really, out of the pre-merge boots here, I do think she is probably the person that has the most potential on a return, despite her probably playing the most actively bad to lead up to her boot. But now let's jump to episode 5, which ends up being another strangely structured episode, with Vessi barely being present across this episode, with the only camp life scene that we get from them is a short one after the journey, which was an absolute necessity, which ends up being another red flag for a lot of the players from Vessi here, though realistically I do think that nothing of relevance actually ended up happening on Vessi in this period of time, considering how stagnant their tribe dynamics seem to be. Now Baka does end up getting a bevy of content here, first with Janine finding the Beware advantage, advantage. And really this ends up being a big episode for Janine, to where people started to talk about Janine as a potential winner candidate, when I really still felt like there was absolutely nothing of substance in her edit, where she is simply shown here because she has to be shown. She found the Beware advantage and went on the journey. She had to be in this episode, and despite that, they still end up undermining her, which really just ended up further sinking her winning chances to me. Where here we do end up seeing the same heist sequence once again play out the exact same, with Gabler being hesitant to give away his bead, only for him to eventually do so. And again, the task itself is boring, but there was some interesting content surrounding it, particularly with it again consistently undermining Ellie and Janine along the way. I mean, we get a confessional from Janine finally saying that her and Ellie have decided to make Sammy their third, while they're essentially just stringing Owen along, immediately followed by Ellie saying that they cannot trust Owen and tell him about their advantage, only for Owen to walk in on them. And really, Owen's preceding content also ends up being pretty mixed to me, with him getting to explain his strategic insight here, but considering he still intends on working with Ellie and Janine, who had just talked about not trusting him and picking Sammy over him, it did leave me a bit confused over how we were supposed to interpret this. But also here, we still see Ellie and Janine still believing that Gabler doesn't know that his idol is valid. And worst of all this content is the fact that we also see them now fully trusting Sammy, the guy who has been consistently undermining them for the last 3 episodes. And after Ellie tells Sammy about the advantage, he ends up talking about using it against them, and we see him telling Gabler about the idol. Again, all really bad content for Ellie and Janine here, but really most of the episode does revolve around Coco, with them once again losing the immunity challenge, and we do get the immunity challenge really early on in the episode, which does become a trend for this season, which I know some people were upset by, though I personally didn't care. And I actually do feel like this allows for the content post immunity challenge to actually have more relevance to the upcoming vote, though realistically, I mean, it's not like they utilize that time that well either. But on Coco, Cassidy does end up getting a massive spike in content here that I could have seen it leading up to her boot, though considering it does end up being a massive push for me and making her my top contender coming into the merge, with her edit at this point being very reminiscent of that of Michelle Fitzgerald, kind of mixed in with aspects of Erica, particularly with them having pretty similar penultimate episodes before the merge. I think mixing that in with the thematic messaging of Erica, I did think that there was definitely merit to her being a potential winner here, though at the same time there were also these resemblances to Victoria Baymonde and Edge of Extinction, to where I could also see that being a trajectory for her as well. But instantly we do see the further expansion of her rivalry with Gio and Ryan, with Gio admitting to her about having split his vote onto her, but also saying that it was Ryan's idea, clearly setting up that one of these 3 were going to be the boot in this episode, though Cassidy ends up being portrayed as a protagonist of this story, with Gio continuing to get his dodo edit, with her calling him clueless and an idiot, and also we have her talking about how she'll buy her time to get payback, which is a strange line considering Gio literally goes in this episode. But following the challenge, we do get this massive dodo edit for Ryan, with him being revealed to have thrown the challenge to get Cassidy out, and decides to make himself the decoy boot for some reason as well. And we do see James and Carla instantly rat him out to Cassidy, making it pretty clear where their allegiance was, also allowing for Ryan to look even more idiotic, where we see him talking to Cassidy with them both lying to each other, but her having the knowledge that he is lying to her. And she ends up mocking his mastermind plan in the confessional. And this is all while the vote does seem to shift onto Ryan here, where due to Gio being on the journey, they assume that he is going to have the advantage, leaving Ryan as the target, which would have been a humorous downfall for Ryan, though one that again seems to be jarring considering his sympathetic betrayal early on in the season. On the journey, we see Gio, Janine, and Jesse go to where they all end up risking their votes, with both Janine and Jesse end up losing their votes, while Gio is the one to get the advantage, though he continues to get his dodo content here, with him pretending like he is on the bottom, essentially doing what Noelle did a couple episodes ago, but completely failing at it, but also doing it while he actually is on the bottom and not realizing that. But again, this leads to the only Vessi camp scene of the episode, of Jesse finding out that he has lost his vote, while Janine on the return gets undermined once again with her being honest to the group after learning about losing her vote, only for Sammy to then talk about how she's playing harder than everyone else, clearly setting her up as a target down the road. But eventually Gio returns to camp, still being cocky about how easy the Cassidy vote's gonna be. But this is where we do see him opening up his advantage, which ends up being the knowledge is power, which I still think is a largely overpowered twist, despite the fact that we haven't seen it being executed properly. Now, I do think it is better on this season, as the Beware advantages aren't as blatant as they were in the last season. That made it abundantly clear who had the idols in those seasons, but it's still not ideal from a pure game perspective, though it has led to interesting TV every time it has appeared. But here he ends up opening it up right in front of Carla, really showing his trust in her, but this ironically ends up leading to her leading the charge to get him out, which I do really question. Now, I do understand that her having an advantage herself makes her scared of the knowledge's power, as he can steal her idol from her, but considering how no one knows about her idol, and there will also be this wide range of options for Gio to steal from coming to the merge, and also considering Gio's seemingly blind trust of Carla, I do feel like this move was overall a net negative, especially with the knowledge's power going back into circulation, though again it ends up working out for her with just another member of her alliance finding it. Now, I know that supposedly her, James, and Cassidy were close, but I do feel like the move to get rid of Gio, even over Ryan, seemed to be a pretty rash one. Though strangely, right before Tribal, we do get a redo of the Lindsay segment from the last episode, but this time with Cassidy, with Carla and James calling her paranoid and consider taking her out after she voices that she wants to get rid of Ryan instead of Gio. Though obviously this time it ends up actually being a red herring. Though again, interestingly, it does show Cassidy not getting her way, and we get no follow-up to this in the following episode, which really becomes a red flag for Cassie's edit, where her content really ends up waning during the early merge, which really lowered my estimations of her winning chances. But Gio ends up being blindsided here, with him having a pretty fun reaction, and we do get this great voting confessional from Cassidy saying she put blanks in their guns when she has the real bullets. And again, Gio was portrayed as a bit of a doofus across this season, coming off as a really bad player in his last couple episodes, with some terrible reads in the game. Though at the same time, he does get a bit of a sympathetic edit early on, like I mentioned with Ryan, that leads to his tonal shift here being kind of jarring. But again, I do feel like Gio was probably the worst player of the season, being on the outs from the very beginning and only surviving the one vote he does due to things outside of his own control. But again, his arrogance across the season did make for fun TV, though clearly an arc that wasn't going to have a deep run, as I never really expected him to make the merge. Now let's talk about episode 6, the merge episode, kind of, as we do get the return of the Earn the Merge twist, which again, I really just hate how they don't consider this the merge, as everything about this is the merge, just that they're not calling it that. But really this ends up being a bit of a strange merge, happening at the same episode count as the previous 2 seasons, but with one extra person due to the lack of a double boot in episode 1. Which, while I do like this change as it does get rid of the non-elimination episode, it does also leave us with a merge at 13 on a 18-person season, something unprecedented, and also just kind of feels dumb that we're having one this early. Especially when the jury doesn't start until 11 anyway, which makes you question why they didn't just merge then, and really I just think it's a consequence of their philosophy of having no swaps here, which also in itself feels pretty dumb here. But the episode does immediately start with the boat arriving at the camps, and the players getting to spend some time at the beach before the challenge, which really felt more in line with how the merges were handled before the new era, and really none of these initial confessionals at the merge end up standing out, though I do feel like Cody got the strongest of the bunch, with him calling out everyone for lying in the meetup, knowing that's about to hit the fan, showing his awareness in this situation, where despite this not being as great of a merge episode as it could have been for Cody, I do feel like the strength of this confessional was enough to escalate him back towards the top of my power rankings after a mixed last batch of episodes. But also during this scene, we do get a confessional from Owen that essentially recaps all the advantages in the game for the audience, and this once again plays into his super fandom, with him talking about how he wished he could see the Chiron that tells him all the advantages. But through this scene he ends up detailing all of them but one, where we do see Noelle telling him about the vote steal, and also through her mentioning Cody's hat, it makes Baca aware of Cody's idol as well, though the one he doesn't know about is Carla's, which is relegated to a secret scene of her playing up to the others that Lindsay went home with the idol in her pocket, which the fact that they forgoed that storyline in the main show felt like another knock on her edit to me. Though initially it did seem like the assumed majority alliance from earlier of Vessi and Baka coming together was going to actually happen here, and through that we end up getting this confessional from Ellie saying that she was made to play Survivor and she's better at this game than she thought, which clearly this was a confessional from very early on in the game, though they end up shoehorning it in here, but by doing so they made her downfall in this episode extremely apparent, as why else would they go out of their way to show this confessional of her being overconfident if that wasn't what it was leading up to. But then we get to the challenge with, again, this being less than 5 minutes into the episode, where Jeff ends up talking about how they've not made the merge yet, despite them all standing in front of him merged, but the earn the merge twist ends up playing out pretty similarly to how it did in the last 2 seasons, just without the inclusion of the hourglass, which makes this twist way more tolerable and also reduces the amount of airtime needed to dedicate to it, but also makes you question at this point, why is this even here? And it just feels like an addition made to make it seem like Survivor's harder in this 26-day format without any real substance to it. But in its current state, it is a largely inoffensive twist, as is just a standard merge vote, but with half the tribe being immune, taking away individual immunity, but making it more so a tribal immunity with everyone voting together, which does limit the options for the eventual vote, and in turn limiting gameplay, though I do think there are situations where this can lead to interesting results, as we saw in Survivor 41, though with the merge happening at 13, we do have one player sitting out, which ends up being Noelle, who gets to back a team, which does end up being an interesting addition here, adding a level of agency to the player not picked, allowing them to select the group that they think they would have a better chance of surviving within. Now here we do also get a fun moment of Janine going to the wrong team accidentally, which is humorous, but the challenge as a whole here ends up being just fine. I mean, it was an extremely physical one, and we do see Carla injuring her hand during it, though her team does eventually have a pretty great come from behind victory, which ends up being a group of a lot of the lesser names coming into the merge, where outside of Jesse and Carla, this is a group comprising of Gabler, Dwight, Janine, and Ryan, alongside Noelle being safe as well, where all these people were people that I could have easily seen being the merge boot coming into this episode, while the other group seemed to contain more of the main characters of the season, with the likes of Cody, Sammy, Ellie, Owen, James, and Cassidy, though with this result, again, it does become abundantly clear that Ellie is going to be the boot. Though the how we got there ends up being pretty fun, where right away we do see Ellie and Owen talking about targeting James, wanting to split the vote between him and Cassidy, though in Ellie's infinite wisdom, she does decide to use Cody as the decoy boot, which I do think this is really what leads to her eventual downfall, even more so than the Gabler of it all, which we'll obviously eventually talk about. But I do think the real reason why Ellie gets taken out here is her playing both sides and telling them different stories. And while yes, she did seem to be actually loyal to the Vessi side of things, her very much agreeing to Coco to target Cody, while also not giving the full story back to Vessi, ends up putting enough doubt for them to consider what if she's playing them. And with Coco's side of things also not believing her from the get-go, this really just felt like the perfect storm for her eventual boot. But then we end up cutting to the merge feast, which again, only the challenge winners got, where we get another dodo moment for Ryan, with him wanting the 7 there to stick together, which again, sure, it would be the majority, but again, this is a group that has no connective tissue, and it just seemed ridiculous for him to even consider this. But really the main event here, and really what ends up kickstarting the rest of the episode, is Gabler deciding to call out Ellie for looking in his bag, and decides to openly target her, leading to a really fun confessional of Gabler saying, by throwing out Ellie's name, well, I'm throwing out Ellie's name. But again, as a game move, this does seem really ridiculous here, considering he is doing all this right in front of Janine, Ellie's closest ally, who quickly tells Ellie what happens after they get back to camp. And Gabler's content is again pretty mixed here, with this being followed up with him getting to explain his rationale here, and him saying that he wants to use this to build trust and wants to look decisive. And really, I don't think taking out Ellie here is necessarily a bad move for Gabler. Now again, his method is not ideal, but even then there's still merit to it, as it makes him look like a straight shooter through him being very open with who he is targeting targeting from the very beginning and never wavering from that. But following this, we do end up seeing Ellie confront Gabler about this, which was a fun scene of them bickering back and forth, but by doing so, Gabler ends up throwing Sammy under a bus as well, with him revealing what Sammy had told him, leading to Ellie confronting Sammy and really just forcing his hand into taking her out at this point. So where again, Ellie seems to think that she's screwed over here by the actions of Gabler, when it really is her own poor gameplay that ends up sending her home, especially also considering the fact that it's her mismanagement of Gabler and her underestimating of Sammy initially. That's what turned Gabler against her to begin with. But despite all this, we then, for some reason, do see Ellie and Janine still thinking that Gabler wants to go Baka strong and is still with them, which is ridiculous considering we also get this scene of Gabler leaking Janine's idol to the others right in front of her, and the fact that they didn't already consider him a lost cause by this point is pretty insane. But again, this is mostly a deviation for the real reasons why Ellie is going home here, as it did seem like her sloppy play of trying to be in the middle is what really cost her here, where we do see James talk to Jesse about her targeting Cody, leading to Vessi flipping on her, unifying Coco and Vessi instead to take out Ellie, which she does seem to pick up on, and we do get this red herring of, is Janine going to play her idol on Ellie, which obviously does end up happening to pretty humorous effect considering the events of the following episode, which, to be fair, I don't think she should have, but it obviously would have been a better use of it than what ends up happening to it. Ellie ends up going home here, though she does get a fun exit with her saying, "You see what trusting Gabler will get you," leading to a fun little banter before she leaves. And really, again, Ellie was a lot of fun on this season, where I do feel like there's a competent player there. She did seem to be on the center of the Baka tribe from the beginning, but she does end up playing an extremely messy game, but one that again is still really entertaining to watch, with her rivalry with Gabler being one of the best storylines of the season, and her being consistently undermined across the season, but again still not portrayed in an unlikable way, being a mostly complex figure here with a bevy of personal content, and one that played pretty aggressively, but again to her detriment. And really, out of this entire cast, she's definitely one of the people I would like to see play again the most, where again I think she has a lot of potential as a player, but is also still a fun narrator while also being someone that's going to play hard. She really feels like a perfect candidate for something like a second chance style season. But now for episode 7, which ends up continuing this tradition of strangely structured episodes, and really this one was due to this weird unnecessary twist that does bog down the episode as a whole. But first, we do get a lot of focus on Janine, with this starting her underdog role on the season that I do feel like is probably going to be the most memorable aspect of her run here, where she was obviously blindsided by the Ellie vote, and we do have this montage of her going person to person doing damage control. We see this scene of Noelle coaching her through it and saying that this was actually good for her game, which, spoiler alert, it was not. But Janine does become a sympathetic figure here, and despite me not thinking she had a chance to win, I did think that this could be set up towards her getting a deeper run in the season, especially with James saying that she would be useful as an asset. Though obviously that storyline ends up going nowhere. The next morning, we do see Baka and Vessi seemingly come back together, which you would assume would put Janine back in a good position, though obviously that doesn't hold. Though even here, we do get talk about how Owen doesn't trust Gabler and that he is a loose cannon, though in Gabler fashion, this is then followed up with some solid content from him, dubbing him the Alligabler, and that he is now going underwater waiting for the right time to strike, and he later also gets personal content after his immunity win, where at that point I did seriously start to look at Gabler as a viable winner here, where despite his negativity, it did feel like this would be the edit that Gabler would be getting if he were to somehow win this season. But the players then get tree mail revealing that something weird is happening here, where the players are told to pair up and they will be competing in the immunity challenge as pairs. And coming into the episode, I was pretty convinced that we were going to be getting tied destinies. This twist from Survivor SA that essentially had players tethered to each other for a round, meaning that the person tethered to the voted out player also ends up going home. And that was a twist I really hated, and thankfully they didn't do that here. But what they did end up doing was also just as bad, just not as game-breakingly bad. Where here, this really just ends up being a massive waste of time, with the immunity challenge taking up about half of the episode, being this 3-stage elimination challenge that ends with an endurance comp at the very end, and this was just extremely dragged out. And across these last couple seasons, I've been someone that I've been fine with the 26-day format. Now, obviously, I do like the 39-day format more, But I actually don't mind the reduction in days conceptually, but I really just don't think production is making the most of this format. And you could tell that they feel the need to compensate for these shorter cycles by adding in dumb twists like this to waste time. And this really felt like one of those instances of this being a one-day cycle, and it felt like production was just not confident they would have enough content to fill out the entire episode. So instead they make a challenge that they can drag out as much as possible. But through this challenge though, we do get some notable moments. I mean, we get another OTT moment for Noelle with her struggling through the net, which causes her and Sammy to get eliminated, but it's propped up as an emotional moment with Jeff talking about how great it is to see everyone helping each other get out after the round is done, which is like, I mean, like obviously, like what else do you expect them to do? Just like leave people stuck in the net? So again, I found that kind of ridiculous. Now the second round was a bit more interesting with a close race towards the end, with Carla falling off at the very end and Ryan and James having some miscommunication, leading to them dropping the ball at the very end. But the final part of the challenge ends up being played in individuals for some reason. Again, really just making these pairs feel even more pointless. But again, it is an endurance comp, and I love that Jeff says the line that we've had men and we've had women win this challenge, which is like, yeah, and that's because this is a challenge that has always specifically been a challenge split by gender, but okay. But even then, it's relevant here considering it's all guys in this final part anyway. But it does come down to Cody versus Gabler, where we get this fun Gabler moment of him giving this long list of people that he's doing this for, which we get a lengthy montage of. But again, he does end up winning the challenge, leading to a really rushed sequence back at camp, which I did find largely underwhelming considering I do feel like if this sequence was portrayed properly, I do think this could have been one of the better rounds of gameplay across the season, though again it ends up making this round come off as underdeveloped. Though I do think part of that was due to this fun reveal that they saved for the following episode that ends up recontextualizing this entire round, but it doesn't change the fact that it does harm this actual episode. But here we do see Baca and Vessi deciding to split their votes between James and Ryan, with James as the primary target once again, clearly at this point going against his initial setup of him wanting to be looked at as a pawn, which is when I completely dropped him from winner contention. But this is where we do see James find a clue at the water well in front of a big group of people, leading to him finding an advantage under the shelter, which ends up being the knowledge is power once again, because Survivor can't let it go. And once again, it doesn't end up getting played effectively, though again does play a major role into this round's events, with the opposing alliance obviously knowing that he has the advantage now, though interestingly they don't know what advantage it is, but they just assume it is the knowledge is power, and through that we see them create a counter plan to it by spreading their advantages around just in case he plays it. Essentially a larger scaled version of what we saw Xander and Mike do in the past, but here, which is obviously an incredible plan if you can trust those that you're giving your advantage to, and can also secure that that person that you're giving it to isn't going home, which obviously ends up being part of the plan here that ends up backfiring on them. But I do think this is one of the few long-term benefits of the knowledge is power advantage here, and that it does lead to this paranoia of it being used, to which can lead to some players making some critical errors. Where here we do see Janine give her idol to Dwight, to which we get a confessional from her saying that she thinks it's safer with him than in her own hands, which obviously doesn't age well. But also here we do see Cody give his idol to Jesse, which with the later reveal makes this round a really insane one for Jesse, with him essentially getting two allies to just hand him idols. But this is where we do see this splinter within the majority alliance, with Jesse revealing that he has a good bond with Carla, which again strangely doesn't get delved into here. But also we see Jesse talking about how Noelle is accumulating power and wants to make a move against her. But when talking it through with Cody, Cody ends up wanting to target Dwight instead, which makes Jesse relent here, which does show Cody getting his way and getting rid of Dwight, who he had been targeting since the very beginning of the game, which while that is positive, I do think Jesse's following confessional about placating Cody, along with the fact that the shifting of the target here did feel very abrupt, did not make this entirely positive for Cody. But this leads us to Tribal, where we do get a little fun Jeff moment of him asking Cody for a surfing metaphor, only for Jeff to completely ignore it and make this massive leap into his own Jaws metaphor. Clearly having that in his head from beforehand and trying to get Cody to lead him into that. Like, I found that funny, but I will say that one of the better aspects of this Jesse reveal being saved for later is the fact that we are under the assumption during this tribal that Dwight has Janine's idol, as well as we know that there is this plan to blindside him, which really adds a lot of tension to this tribal, and you do really feel for Janine here, knowing how screwed she is in this situation, especially when the Dwight votes start to get read. We see her trying to get her idol back, which, even if she did, it would have been invalid anyway, but here she ends up losing her idol along with one of her new closest allies after having just lost her other closest ally. So this ends up really propelling this underdog story for her. Though another strange thing about this vote is that we find out that Sammy flipped along with Jesse and Cody without any real explanation to that, which ends up being a massive red flag for his edit. But also we do find out that the jury doesn't start here, which again makes sense from a numbers perspective, though it's strange to see the second vote after a merge not be a jury member. I know this has happened before in Australian Survivor, but again, it's strange precedent for Survivor US here. But with that, we do lose Dwight, who again I found to be a likable figure across this season, but one that just felt like one of the more under-edited figures throughout the season, where he gets almost half of his confessionals in the premiere, and afterwards it just felt like his storyline with Jesse was dropped after episode 3. Really just Dwight in general just felt like fodder in the edit, where I was always expecting him to be an early merge boot like this. Now despite that, I do think Dwight seemed like a solid enough player, seeming to be one of the heads of strategy within the Baka Vessi alliance, but never seemed to get much of a footing on this season, seemingly having Jesse and Cody running circles around him, which leads to his eventual boot here. But now let's jump into episode 8, where we do spend a lot of time on the return to Tribal, where we do see Sammy doing damage control for his flip in the previous round, though he still never properly gets to explain why he flipped. Where with this, and also some mixed content later on, this episode is where I did end up dropping Sammy from winner contention, with him feeling like a player that talks a big game but never ends up living up to that, and also feeling in line with recent runners up in that they have strong edits early on in the season but then they die off coming to the merge. But finally we do see him telling Janine that the idol being flushed was good for her game, being the second episode in a row that we started with someone saying that this bad thing that happens to Janine is good for her, which again really does not age well in this episode. But again, you really do still feel bad for Janine, where she's like crying over feeling like an idiot and tells Sammy that he broke her heart. But following this, we do get this montage of everyone learning about Dwight going home with Janine's idol until we hear from Jesse, where he reveals that he actually has the idol. Being this big reveal, showing us this flashback of Dwight handing him the idol right before Tribal, being the first time I can remember of them saving a reveal like this for the episode after that event happened. And through Jesse essentially stealing Janine's idol here, it does really recontextualize the previous vote, giving Jesse more incentive to take out Dwight, while also making Jesse's gameplay in the previous round look a lot more impressive. Though again, through this reveal, and it being really shoved under the rug after this point, I do think it really minimizes the impact of this move. I mean, it could have been this big moment for the season. However, I think it ends up just being kind of an afterthought here. Now, I get why they did it, as Jesse revealing the idol beforehand would have taken away the suspense from the actual Dwight vote, where it would have been more obvious at that point that he was going home. Though I should also mention that this ends up being a trend on this season of leaving out information during an episode only to then reveal it at the very beginning of the following episode, which again I do think is a cool editing trick, but again one that leads to this really muddied editing, with it feeling like we're losing out on so much of the game information, giving us less understanding on the true events of the game. Though I do get them wanting to try something new here, and I do think there are points where this can be effectively used, but most of the time it's used here and ends up feeling unnecessary, or in this case just feeling like the show's leaving out some really important information. So again, I get why they made this decision. I do think it was a fun reveal here, but it is one that just didn't have the impact that I feel like it could have had it been portrayed more traditionally. Especially because, again, it feels like we never get the payoff to this Jesse-Dwight relationship. And again, feeling like another really underdeveloped relationship across the season. But again, still extremely impressive of Jesse that over the course of this last round, he just had 2 allies hand him idols. And here we don't see Cody asking for his idol back, putting him in full possession of 2 idols at this point. Though I will say that at the same time, the Dwight move in particular, I don't know how intentional of a move that really was from Jesse. Where really I do feel like he more so lucked into that situation, more so than it was him subtly manipulating Dwight the entire time to get him to hand him the idol. But either way, it ends up putting Jesse in a very powerful position here, with 2 idols and one of them being a secret. But following this, we do also get some personal content for Owen, only for him to be talked about as the target for the Majority Alliance, James in particular calling him a snake, which starts their rivalry, which ends up being a fun aspect of this and the following episode. Though clearly this was all set up to Owen winning immunity, which he ends up doing, though this also ends up being the round where we get the return of what I guess is now a new era tradition, in that being the rice negotiation, which again, another aspect of the new era that I simply just never thought about as something that could potentially come back here, and really this does nothing for me. Though I did find it funny how in 41 to 42 the negotiation ended with 4 people sitting out, but here Jeff starts his negotiation with 5, to which when James asks to lower it to 4, he straight up turns him down, which makes me question, what is the point of a negotiation if Jeff isn't going to negotiate? But we do get a humorous moment here of James trying to get Owen to drop out of the challenge, which does end up being some negative content for James here, especially with Owen proceeding to call him patronizing, which just in general, I do also think this was a bad move for James, again, making him look cocky with him thinking he can actually pull off this move when it really had no chance of actually working, but also feeling like this was set up towards his eventual downfall. Now, also in the lead up to the negotiation, we do get some weird content to set up how deteriorated everyone is, with Carla getting to talk about her weird dream. We hear about Ryan's dream meal of burritos wrapped in pizza, which is just weird. But Ryan does end up getting more content in this episode, once again highlighting this dichotomy in his edit, with him initially being portrayed as this challenge beast and this big provider for camp, while also getting to talk about his cerebral palsy again, only for them to then set him up as the red herring, which leads to the return of his dodo edit, with him deciding to spend the rest of the day out in the water fishing, which is where we get confessionals from the others talking about how bad of a player he is. And we do get Sammy trying to use this to his advantage by trying to put the target on his back, where this episode ends up spending a lot of time focusing on Sammy trying to find a way to flip against this newly formed 7-person alliance from the previous episode and start working with the likes of Owen, Janine, Noelle, and Gabler. And I did spend a lot of this episode thinking that this flip was actually going to happen and that Ryan was going to go home, and it very easily could have, considering Sammy and co, especially when adding in Noelle's vote steal, for sure had the numbers to flip the game here, but they just don't, and it's not really even explained why they don't. We do see Sammy attempting to make this a unanimous vote by trying to rope in the majority into voting for Ryan as well, where we do see the likes of Cassie and Carla immediately agreeing to this plan, wanting to get rid of a strong guy, and we do get the return of Cassie's feud with Ryan, and really just everything seemed poised for Ryan to be the boot here, until the plan gets back to Cody, where despite Cody having a pretty small presence across this episode, he does get some pivotal positive content here, where he ends up not agreeing with this plan, still wanting Janine out, who now becomes the target after Owen had won immunity. And really this just feels like the show going out of its way to give Cody credit for this move, and this does convince James to back out of the plan. But here we do end up seeing Cassie fighting to keep the vote onto Ryan, being upset that another girl is going, the first time the show has mentioned this trend that had been a major talking point on social media. Though I do think this episode in particular seemed to be the peak of that negativity, with obviously Janine ending up going home in what ends up being a near unanimous vote, which did very much upset people, especially with Janine in particular getting a sympathetic edit towards the end of her run here. And while yes, I do think it is underwhelming to see this potential big move get thwarted here, I do understand why it doesn't go through, where it does seem to stem from the players in the majority, particularly in Jesse and Cody, still maintaining their relationships with the outsiders, particularly with Noelle and Sammy. And Sammy, despite what he said earlier in the episode about not wanting to ruffle any feathers, he did seem to still want to go along with whatever the majority was, which really allowed Janine to be the easy vote here, where the only person who ends up voting with her ends up being Cassidy, which is a vote that's never explained on the show, despite Despite the fact that there is this rogue vote, ends up being a pretty important plot point to the following episode. But again, we do lose Janine here, who gets a really sympathetic edit with everything seeming to go wrong for her. Though I do think the fact that people seem to put no blame on her for these things happening does feel kind of strange to me, where again, I do just feel like she just played this season really terribly. I mean, there's literally not a single tribal that she attends that she ends up getting her way, and she, alongside Ellie and all of their overconfidence and mismanagement of their relationships with Sammy and Gabler, end up being the reasons why they are targets coming into the early merge. And while she does have some skill for the game, I just don't feel like she was able to demonstrate that throughout this season, with her not really being that effective at any point in the game. And she fails to save Mariah, she gets blindsided at the Ellie vote, she loses her idol at the Dwight vote, and then is taken out in a near unanimous vote immediately afterwards. Again, it really just is a terrible game played here, but she still ends up being a likable presence despite that, and one that I do think could do well if she were to ever play again. But now let's jump into episode 9, which ends up being the return of the split tribal twist, which we've had at the final 10 since the beginning of the new era, and I still hate its placement here, skipping over to the final 9 vote, which is typically a very important vote in Modern Survivor, but they end up keeping that terrible tradition here, in a position where I do feel like they could have easily placed it at the final 12 to where it would have been better there. But here we do start the episode with more focus on the Owen-James rivalry, with Owen getting this big underdog edit here, revealing that he was told about the Janine vote at the very last second by Gabler after having been lied to by James that the vote was going on to Ryan. Leading to a fun confessional from Owen saying that he's not the Godfather, to which I was just waiting for him to say he's James in a Russell Hantz voice, but we instantly see some actual drama between the two, with James wanting to talk to him only for Owen to turn him down, to which we have James complaining about how Owen voted for him twice, which kind of remind me of Abby Maria, but this ends up leading us to the immunity challenge, where we do get the reveal of the twists, which, again, they shouldn't have been surprised at, but we have the groups being broken up in a pretty boring way in my eyes, with these two groupings having very clear setup targets on both of them, with one side containing James and Owen and the other side containing Cassie and Ryan, which made this episode feel like those 4 people were the only ones in contention to be booted here. Now, the order that these groups go to tribal was determined by the immunity challenge, though I will say that I do think these results here did end up messing with the pacing of the episode, as I do think the first group was a way more interesting vote than the second group was, to where just not much of interest ends up happening there. But the first group ends up containing Owen, Sammy, Noelle, Carla, and James, where Carla does win immunity despite having an injured hand. This does once again bring back Carla's growth arc, in her talking about how she won because she now believes in herself, which in general this episode did feel like a bit of a resurgence for Carla after having a quieter last few batch of episodes. But again, most of the content with this group did end up revolving around this Owen versus James dynamic, where we instantly see this interaction between the two at the water well, where we do interestingly see Owen using Cassie's rogue vote that she never admitted to lie to James here about having voted for Ryan as he wanted. Though I did find a lot of Owen's actions here really questionable, as he never mentions on their show the fact that he is lying here, making it seem like he actually believes that he's in the right when he is straight up lying to James's face here, while James is not wrong, that Owen has targeted him twice at this point. But really, this fight between the two was a lot of fun, with Owen saying that everything is James's fault in his brain, leading to James walking into camp yelling how everything is my fault, and they end up having another argument in front of everyone, which I don't feel like we see this that much in modern day Survivor, so again, it was refreshing to see that. And we do get a fun little moment from Noelle asking if everyone wants papaya in the middle of this fight, but really Owen is initially set up to be the easy boot here, though this is where Noelle joins the story, where we see her telling James that she now plans on using her vote steal on Owen to avoid him using the shot in the dark, which really seemed like a waste of a vote steal at that point, as again, why would Noelle care that much in securing that Owen would go home, only for us to get the reveal that Noelle is actually lying to James, and instead is trying to placate him into not playing his knowledge as power, and that the real plan is to save Owen and vote James out, assuming to have the vote of Sami as well. And again, 100% taking out James here is her optimal move here, and I know she gets a lot of praise for this move that she does with the vote steal, using it in a way to counter the knowledge's power, but I will say I did find a lot of it really unnecessary. Now, at the end of the day, the vote steal is a very situational power that, for all she knows, she'll never have the opportunity to use again, but again, it just never seemed like James had any intention of using his knowledge's power here, and I just find it funny that her way of countering the knowledge's power is to use the advantage he could have stolen to make an extremely marginal move. Now again, I do think this is an innovative way to play the vote steal, but in reality, it is used here as an extremely defensive move, when a defensive move wasn't even necessary, while also putting a target on her back, with this being looked at as a good move by the others. So again, I do feel like this move was overall a net negative for her, though I do understand why she felt like she needed to secure that Owen was going to stay in the game. But this ends up setting up this James blindside that you would think would be locked in with Sami's vote, though here we once again see Sami wavering, where he ends up telling Karla about this plan, talking about wanting to make sure he votes the same as Karla, which really opens up this opportunity for the vote to flip, and this relationship between Sami and Karla here does end up feeling, again, like another really abrupt relationship. Now, we have seen them talking in previous episodes, but again, they never properly set up their relationship until here, making all this trust that Sami seems to have in Karla seem kind of jarring. Though through that, this vote is portrayed to us as Karla's decision, though in reality, I do think she felt strong-armed to go along with the James vote, and I do think overall this is a pretty bad move for her, one that gets rid of a shield for her pretty early on, gets rid of someone that really trusts her at this point in the game, and also strengthens the players that are directly opposed to her, which puts her in a bit of danger in the following round. So I did feel like this was overall the wrong move for her, especially considering that there was a very easy out in just telling James to use his knowledge's power, but again, she just doesn't, and instantly when Noelle plays her vote steal, you just know that James is pretty screwed there, though we do get a pretty fun tribal of more bickering between James and Owen, where Jeff himself seems shocked that there's fighting on Survivor, which kind of shows you the sad state of modern Survivor, but James goes out unanimously and looked genuinely devastated as he went to go sit on the jury, which was a nice change of pace from these more playful exits we see across this season. But now let's talk about the other group, which contains Cassidy, Jesse, Gabler, Ryan, and Cody, with this almost instantly being a clear vote between Cassidy and Ryan, with Jesse and Cody being the swings, with Cody ending up getting solid content here, winning the immunity challenge, and later being the one shown to rope Gabler into the plan, and assumably picks him up as a number here, seemingly setting himself up well for the endgame, though also this ends up being a good chunk of content for Gabler as well, with him now starting to build solid relationships. Cassie also ends up getting solid content in this episode, finally getting her backstory segment, talking about her sister who passed away, and I'll be honest, this was another instance where I was initially tricked into thinking that Cassie was going to go home here, where I was actually thinking that Ryan was looking like a losing finalist at this point, but again, the vote does come down to Cody and Jesse, who end up having a confusing conversation over saying that their decision is going to be based around who goes home from the other group, but here it is set up to be the complete opposite of what ends up happening, which what they were saying here didn't even make sense logically, so I really just don't get why this sequence was portrayed the way it was. But again, I do feel like they pretty much gave away who was going home by the end of it, where we do see Cassie's voting confessional where she seems extremely confident about the fact that this is the final part of her revenge plan, which, considering her hesitancy earlier in the episode, her confidence here made it clear that she was told that Ryan was going home, to where he ends up getting taken out in another unanimous vote, where again, this group's dynamics simply were not as interesting as the other ones. But now let's talk about the boots, starting off with James, who I found to be a bit of a strange figure on this season, getting a really strong premiere episode that seemed to perfectly set himself up for a deep run, setting up a thematic storyline and his relationship with Lindsay, only for all that to not matter by the time of the merge. I mean, his edit essentially directly conflicts those initial themes, and I do think that is disappointing, as I did find James to be a pretty likable presence, one that is a solid player, one that had some fun moments along the way. Again, his rivalry with Owen added a lot of fun drama here, but he just seemed to mismanage his threat level coming into the merge, though through that we did get a pretty fun downfall for him. But now let's talk about Ryan, who I found to be such a weird figure on this season, largely because he started off being shown as this like new golden boy for the show. Clearly someone that was supposed to be looked at as an inspiration and does have a great story, but then his edit starts to shift towards him being looked at as an idiot, with him being portrayed as this really terrible player when that consistently gets undermined in the edit. And this does feel like the ramification of this new era's editing style, them wanting to highlight the backgrounds of these players, but doing so in a way that doesn't really make sense for the story of the season. But again, I do think Ryan played pretty terribly here, being on the bottom of his initial tribe and almost getting himself voted out there. And then the post-merge just felt like he was an extremely expendable number that gets taken out despite not having much respect out there. And I just feel like overall, he's a pretty mediocre player. And unlike a lot of the other people we've talked about on this season, I just don't really see that potential for him even if he were to return. But now let's jump into episode 10, where we do see the ramifications of the previous votes, except for the fact that no one really seemed to care about Ryan being voted out. But the James vote did play a factor here, particularly from the reveal that Carla knew about the James vote from Sammy, which seems to have negative effects on Sammy's game, with Noelle talking about how he's overplaying, and he starts to build this stigma around him of him being a flipper, which by this point it became abundantly clear that Sammy is not winning this game, where through this content he ends up being at the bottom of my power rankings by the end of this episode. But also early on we do get a good chunk of content from Jesse, where he brags about being in the middle of the game, which did feel like set up to his eventual downfall. But also here we interestingly get the reveal that he knows about Carla's idol, and this episode makes it clear that not everyone believed Carla's story, which is strange that this is just randomly told to us here. That obviously makes it make sense why that previous Carla scene was cut, but again, still contradictory to some of the storylines we've seen before. But then we get to the reward challenge, which ends up being your pretty standard fare until we see Noelle struggling on the balance beam. And really at first I thought we were getting another one of these like surreal moments of the fact that they were going to allow her to finish the beam after the challenge was done, but instead she ends up actually eventually getting through it and has one of the best come from behind victories in the history of the show, which obviously the show makes a meal out of. But this really ends up being OTT content for Noelle, who ends up getting a massive visibility spike on this episode, which obviously leads to her eventual boots. But the reward here ends up including letters from home, during which Owen and Jesse get lengthy segments talking about their families, while Sammy and Noelle both get ignored, once again sinking Sammy's winning chances there. But here we also see them strategize in planning to split the vote between Cassidy and Carla, which, considering it did seem like the women of this cast were aware that the other women were going home early, I did end up finding it kind of weird how this entire episode is essentially the women targeting each other, with Noelle coming for Cassidy and later Carla, while we then cut to Cassidy and Carla, who now want to target Noelle, with her now being looked at as a big threat. Though here we do get a good amount of content around Cassidy and what ends up being a pretty perfect episode for her winning chances, where she gets the comment on finally taking Ryan out. She eventually gets her target Noelle out by the end of the episode. She ends up building a bond with Cody after being left at camp with him. She also later wins immunity, to which she follows that up with a confessional literally saying that she can now see herself winning this game, which, did feel a bit too forward there. But along with that, I do feel like this also ends up being a pretty bad episode for Cody, who was my top contender at this point, but he does end up having a pretty quiet episode one here, but one with a lot of subtle undercutting for him, with his only confessional being one of him being upset that he's not in the reward, as there's not going to be game talk back at camp, only for us to then see game talk between him and Cassidy. Also later in the episode, he does really come off as a lackey for Jesse and kind of gets portrayed as being overconfident alongside Jesse. So again, unlike his last few episodes, where even there where his presence wasn't as overt as it was early on this season, he was still getting positive content when he was shown. This ends up being the complete antithesis to that, to which it did lessen my confidence in his winning chances. But again, this ends up being a pretty big episode for Jesse, with him making the call to take out Noelle, and talks about his struggle in doing so, but then proceeds to give his rundown on how to execute a blindside, running through his 3 rules, showing him getting Noelle to split the vote onto Sammy, which then allows him to potentially win out on a plurality vote here. But then we see him talk about needing a backup plan, leading to us seeing him reel in Gabler into his plan. Gabler, which also having a pretty strong episode here, getting to articulate his position in the middle. But here we see Gabler reluctantly agreeing to his plan, with this entire sequence making Jesse look like this mastermind, with it ending with him and Cody talking about how they're running this game, only for us then to cut to Gabler, who ends up talking to Carla about how Jesse and Cody are running the game and how he doesn't like how they surprised him minutes before Tribal, completely undercutting Jesse's previous segment, again in a situation where this sequence felt largely unnecessary. I mean, there was no proper setup to an eventual Jesse boot in this episode, so the fact that they added in this Gabler scene, again, feels like the editors going out of their way to show you that Jesse's not in as good of a position as he thinks. And in retrospect, this scene can be looked at as the setup of Gabler's win, though I do feel like it doesn't properly do so. Again, this is a scene of Gabler talking about targeting Cody and Jesse, despite the fact that he never directly targets Cody and Jesse. And while yes, he is eventually the downfall of Jesse, he never directly targets them as this scene implies, which makes this an even stranger scene in retrospect. But either way, the Noelle blindside does go through here with her getting heroic music on her way out, which of course she does. And with that, let's just talk about Noelle, who, again, as a person seems great. She seems to for sure be this inspiration that the show tries to portray her as, but again, I do feel like the editing of this season just felt extremely heavy-handed for her, to the point where it really felt exploitative. It felt like her role on the season was to be this inspirational figure, and really nothing beyond that. Where despite her having some interesting game moments across this season, it felt like those moments were subjugated in favor of her talking about her backstory for the 5th time. It really just felt like the actual game that she played on this season was only demonstrated on the show at moments where it felt absolutely necessary, which I find to be extremely underwhelming when again she ended up having a really interesting trajectory in the game here, one that I just wish got a lot more focus, where she was constantly losing allies, but despite that was able to recover afterwards and build new allies. Where while I don't think she played the greatest game in the world, I do think she is one of these players that has a lot of potential in this game. However, I think her biggest issue on this season is the fact that she had the likes of Jesse and Cody again just outplaying her at pretty much every turn. Now for episode 11, which ends up being an episode that really perplexed me, continuing the shift where I thought the season was going, which for a season to still be this up for grabs with only a few episodes left is definitely a rarity. Where even Erica's edit I had locked in at this point in the season, where in this season the edit just continuously shifted. This one in particular definitely changing how I thought the endgame was going to play out, but here we do get a lot of focus on the return to camp, with Sammy being blindsided by the vote and immediately trying to lie about his vote, which seemed like a poor play here, continuing off this sketchy persona he has built, and through doing this he ends up throwing Gabler under the bus, which is probably a bad look for him, and while I'll never get to mention on their show, it does seem like he completely neglected his relationship with Gabler by the end of this. And this is all for him to just later admit to the vote anyway, really doing the worst of both worlds here. And along the way, we do get this dodo music playing during this scene, though this is later followed up by positive content for him, with him getting propped up for being a good fire maker, and he gets this personal content that he was missing in the previous episode, getting to talk about his letter from home and talking about being inspired by his mom to try, leading to Sammy campaigning to Carla, lying to her about Cassidy having thrown her name out, which initially this seems ridiculous. I mean, you would think that Carla would just brush him off, as this is just Sammy saying whatever he can to get the target off his back, but somehow Carla actually believes this, and out of the blue decides to target Cassidy, which is really bad from every aspect. It is terrible from an editing perspective, as this is showing her being tricked by Sammy, and also with the talk later about using this against her. This is definitely the last straw for me with Carla's edit, with this just being a terrible look, and clearly was being set up to backfire on her. But again, even from a game perspective, this is also really bad for her to cut her closest ally at Final 7 when you have so many other more dangerous options, especially the likes of Jesse and Cody, who are clearly outmaneuvering her here. But this is where we do see the rationalization of this by revealing that Carla had just told Cassidy about her idol, and that she wants Cassidy out to cover her tracks. But the dumb thing about this is that we're at Final 7, meaning there's only 2 more opportunities to play her idol following this anyway. And she is also in a position where others unknowingly already know about her idol. And in this world where she thinks Cassidy had flipped on her, what's stopping her from leaking that info anyway? So I found the explanation here kind of dumb, and it did once again feel like another rash move from Carla of her letting go of her own allies, and in turn worsening her own position. But beyond that, Gabler also gets strong content once again here, this time with him talking about setting up his endgame by making a deal with Owen to go to the end, talking about still hiding in plain sight. Though backing off the last episode, episode, I was actually underwhelmed that this targeting of Jesse and Cody didn't come to roost here, where coming into this episode, I was fully convinced that this was going to be the Jesse boot, only for this to end up being kind of a cooldown episode for him, and somehow never gets mentioned as a target. And with his current position of having 2 idols in his pocket, this made me reevaluate where I thought his story was going, considering the concept of it now feeling ridiculous that he would go home within any of the next 2 votes. But also Owen does get a decent amount of content here, to the point where it felt like the show was just outright telling you that he was going to be a losing finalist, with him comparing himself to Charlie Brown and outright saying to Gabler that he doesn't think he can win the game, and how he hasn't voted correctly since the Mariah vote. But eventually the episode does progress with a boat arriving at camp, telling the players that an advantage is hidden in the jungle, leading to a massive hunt. That ends up being a fun segment, though also felt very artificial. Again, once again feeling like a twist added to the game due to production not feeling confident enough in their own product here. This ends up being a really funny scene, with the advantage being hung up on the tree and everyone just walking by it. And it takes until Cody is literally leaning on the tree while talking to Gabler for him to finally notice it. This ends up being some pretty strong content for Cody, with this living up to his playing hard and fast mantra, where he talks about how he's one of the last people to continue looking. Though realistically, this content also kind of had to be on the show, considering he does find an advantage, and that advantage ends up being a new one called Choose Your Champion, where Cody is now given the opportunity to pick another player, and if that player ends up winning immunity, he gets immunity as well. Which we do see him getting it right in picking Owen, but straight up at first, I thought this was a pretty lame advantage, just barely increasing your chances of winning immunity, though the interesting aspect of all this actually comes from later, where Jeff fully explains the rules of this advantage, where it turns out that the results of this advantage are not revealed until after the votes are cast, with this immunity essentially having the power of an idol instead of an immunity necklace, and all of this radically changes the power of this advantage. One essentially giving the holder implicit immunity without the worry of voting for them, as they are very openly having a chance of their votes just straight up getting nullified, but also gives the holder more agency with the vote, as again, straight up, the immunity idol is more powerful than immunity necklace. So once this part of the advantage was announced, I was actually more on board with the concept of it. But the challenge here ends up being the return of a classic challenge in Last Gasp, a challenge that I assumed that they stopped using due to safety issues, though after seeing this season, maybe it was just because of the difficulty of having to rely on the tide, but here we end up seeing the challenge go for a ridiculous length, nearly 3 hours, and to the point where the tide starts to recede, with both Owen and Carla still surviving, and here we get a bit of a questionable production move from my point of view, of them declaring them both as winners of the challenge, both getting immunity, which is kind of lame. Now, obviously I get it from production's point of view, of them already being annoyed that this is going on for so long and in turn messing up with their schedule, and also the main appeal of the challenge is now gone with the tide going down. Plus also you're running the risk of Owen and Carla getting sick from their prolonged time in the water. Like, I fully get why they stopped the challenge here, but to hand both of them immunity does feel very strange, and again I hate how much Jeff props this up as this unprecedented moment. But also, I do think this definitely has worrying ramifications for the game in this round as well, where obviously this doesn't happen, but this was a now potential advantage get-in situation. With Owen and Carla both having individual immunity, Cody has immunity from the Choose Your Champion advantage, and then there are still 3 idols left in the game here, where if all of them were played, that would mean only one person would not be immune going home by default, which is obviously a situation that they should be trying to avoid, though again I think production actually likes it for some reason. But following this, we do get the vote coming down to Sammy and Cassidy, with Sammy instantly talking about playing his shot in the dark, while Cassidy ends up getting sympathetic content, talking about being disappointed to lose out on immunity, and still being propped up as the one leading the charge against Sammy. Though we then get more of Carla targeting Cassidy, which has her pulling in Sammy to flip the vote, and it is mostly the others talking about the possibility of this, where we do see Sammy telling Cody about this plan and then Cody telling Jesse, to where they seem to be on board with it, though again we do get some subtle undermining for Jesse here, with him talking about for this round he's gonna just go with the flow, only for him to instantly go against that by now recognizing that Carla and Sammy must be closer than Carla and Cassidy, and in turn wants to get rid of Sammy to isolate Carla. And this is all despite the fact that Cody wants to really get Cassidy out here, which ends up feeling like undermining for Cody as well. not just in him not getting his way here, but also in him thinking that Carla is closer to Cassidy than Sammy, which the edit clearly is portraying the opposite. Now, Jesse also gets undermined here through his conversation with Owen as well, with Owen openly not trusting him, which seemed to take away from Jesse's mastermind edit here. But coming into the tribal, I was actually expecting Cassidy to go home at first, with me not expecting Cody to get as undermined as he does here, but we do end up getting some pretty fun bickering at Tribal, from Sammy openly talking about wanting to play his shot in the dark and others being annoyed at that, only for that to end up failing and Sammy ends up going out in a unanimous vote, which again did shock me, with me thinking that Sammy was primed to be a losing finalist at this point. And while in retrospect the signs were clearly there for him to be set up as the boot for this episode, I will have to admit that I actually was not fully expecting it. But with that, let's talk about Sammy, who ends up getting a pretty strange edit by the end of it. Again, getting undermined constantly towards the end of his run, despite some massive glimpses of positivity early on. That does make his downfall at this particular time a bit unexpected. Though I do think Sammy ends up being one of the better teenage players to be on the show, being well positioned for a lot of the game, seeming to be an expert at finding himself in the majority, even at points where he has no reason to be. Though I do think this constant flipping seemed to catch up to him to where no one trusts him anymore, and really I think as a player he's one that does talk a big game, though doesn't really live up to it, with him not really perpetuating a single big move this entire season, despite constantly talking about how hard he's going to play. But I did still find the first 2/3 of his game here to be pretty impressive, and even in his boot round here, he was able to cause this paranoia between Carla and Cassidy, which to me makes him a player with a lot of potential if we were to see him again, probably with some more life experience. But then let's jump into episode 12, which ends up being one of the better, if not the best episode of the season, with it containing one of the biggest blindsides of the entire season. Though first we do start the episode of learning that Carla was never looped into the plan to vote out Sammy and instead switched her vote at the last second due to him playing his shot in the dark, being sketched out that her plan wasn't going to go through, which I guess shows that Carla had the right read there. Though this episode continues to show Carla in a negative light, where we then see Owen almost instantly rat her out to Cassidy, telling her how Carla was targeting her and causing Cassidy to now question her, to which she is completely unconvincing during this conversation. But this is where we get to the episode's namesake, in Carla proceeding to fake cry to her, talking about making it a telenovela, and this really felt like content that was clearly going to backfire on Carla, especially with this leading to her saying that if you don't believe me, go to Jesse, leading to Carla prompting Jesse about this, bragging about how great her acting skills are, only for Jesse to then go throw her under the bus to Cassidy in order to further isolate them, which has Cassidy now wanting to take out Carla, which seemed to play right into Jesse's hands and felt like content kind of undermining her to a degree as well. Though following this, we do get a reward challenge for some reason, which strangely ends up being the challenge that Russell Swan passed out during in Survivor Samoa, which was a weird callback. But here Owen, Cody, and Carla win the reward, where Carla gives an impassioned spiel about how she has been targeted for no reason because she doesn't have an idol, to where we actually see Cody and Owen believing her, which is a pretty bad look for them, though is also a bad look for her, with her saying that this should allow her to keep her idol until 5, only for this to instead convince Cody and Owen that they can now target her as she doesn't have an idol to protect herself. So really everyone in this scene comes out looking bad, but back at camp we do see the three there in Gabler, Cassidy, and Jesse make a final 3 deal, being headed by Gabler and what ends up being more solid content for him, with him talking about hiding in plain sight once again, and this seeming to set up his endgame. But really, this ends up being a really random final 3 at first, but that is when we get the mention that Cassidy and Jesse need to split away from their pairings and need to take out both Carla and Cody by the end in order to win, which the concept of Cody beating Jesse and Jesse being perceived as the second command to Cody is something that really comes out of left field to me. I mean, I do feel like that aspect of the edit was never fully represented until now. While this obviously really sets up the Cody boot, it does in a way that feels very abrupt and doesn't really fit into the story that we've been shown, with most of the strategy talk that we've been seeing between the two is being led by Jesse, and Jesse gets more of the mastermind edit. The fact that this isn't the way that Jesse is being perceived out there feels very jarring, but also makes complete sense in how, again, watching the show, you do question why is no one targeting Jesse, and really it just showcases why, with him seeming to master his threat management across this season. But here we have Cassidy reveal Carla's idol to the others, to where Cody ends up getting upset at how Carla has lied to him, setting up his plot for after the immunity challenge, and this definitely felt like it was leading to a potential rebound for him, when in reality it was doing the complete opposite. But then we get to the immunity challenge, which has Cassidy winning, though Cody ends up coming a couple seconds short, though strangely we do also get a lot of focus on Carla in this challenge, but they're constantly getting cramps during the puzzle, which Jeff obviously loves for some reason. But following this, we do see a lot of talk about the idols, with Owen and Gabler being worried that the two idols being played will cause one of them to go home. This is all followed by a conversation between Cody and Carla, with them agreeing to fake that they're going to be playing their idols, only for them to keep them and in turn turn the tables on one of Gabler or Owen, leading to Carla being confident about her staying and not needing her idol, only for Cody to reveal that this was all a plot to trick Carla into not playing her idol, which in itself could have been a really great play here for Cody, getting himself to the final 5 with an idol in his possession, kind of. But this is where we cut to Jesse, where he talks about how this is just a move that's going to add more to Cody's resume, and despite how much he loves Cody, he has to care about his family first, and gets emotional while talking about the need to vote out Cody, which is a super cutthroat move here in blindsiding your own ally while in possession of his idol, though this is an extremely impressive move to see Jesse pull off here. Though I do question if this was truly the optimal move. Now I think at the end of the day, it all comes down to win equity, and if Jesse truly believed that Cody would beat him at the end, then I do think this was the correct move for him to make, to take out this jury threat in a position where Jesse's already guaranteed to make Final 4, but as Jesse mentions himself here, Cody is someone that is willing to take him to the end, and with the Final 4 format now involving the fire-making twist, it is a twist that greatly benefits people that have solid allies that are willing to protect you and take you to the end, and again, Cody would do that for Jesse here, and if Jesse does beat Cody in a final tribal situation, I do think this is really the best of all worlds here. Though it did really seem like that was in question, so through that I do get why Jesse felt the need to make this move, though it is a very forward move, where Jesse really makes a show out of how he plays this, using Cody's own idol on Owen, making it clear to the others that this is his move, but also by playing his idol, he ends up flushing Carla's idol as well, all a really impressive play from Jesse here, seeming to put himself into a position where he should be guaranteed to win if he gets to the end, though the path there definitely does become slightly tougher. Though we do get a bit of a red herring back at camp right before Tribal of Cody wanting his idol back, with Carla wanting to see it, and this does lead to worry of Cody deciding to keep his idol, though that really ends up amounting to nothing. Though I do also question, why does Cody even give the idol back? I get the worry of a knowledge is power, and that's the reason why they handed the idol off to begin with, but again, we're at the final 6. I feel like the worry of a knowledge is power is pretty much gone by this point, but for some reason, I guess Cody decided to give it back. But really, we get to the actual blind side, and it just ends up being pretty glorious here. I mean, seeing Cody realize that when Jesse plays his idol, that something is going wrong, and him questioning Jesse as the votes start to come up is just really gut-wrenching, but really a blindside that this season needed, where I feel like this season was one that was really lacking a big moment, an all-time great vote-off, and thankfully we did get that here, both with Jesse's impressive play, but also the emotion Cody displayed during it, leading to fun final words from him, where he playfully flicks Jesse off. But with that, let's talk about Cody, who I was very surprised to see go home here, where I initially had him as a very likely winner. Coming into the merge, though his edit did start to wane in the last few episodes, which made him look more like a runner-up to me, feeling like his edit was similar to that of recent runners-up, who had strong starts only for their flaws to unravel towards the end. So to see him go here at Final 6 was definitely a big shock to me, though I couldn't ask for a better way for him to go here, from being blindsided by his own #1 ally, again in a really heartbreaking way. But really, Cody ends up being one of the better characters on this season, having a fun energy and how excitable he is about the game, but he also ends up being a really solid player as well, unexpectedly unexpectedly to me, as I thought he was going to be a joke coming into this season, but him and Jesse really end up running most of the game here. Though obviously it did seem like he lacked in threat management by the end and also was a bit too blindly loyal to Jesse. Though I don't feel like those things are necessarily massive knocks against him as a player, where I do feel like those issues are easily fixable on a return, and straight up, I would very much expect Cody to do very well on a return, which through his portrayal on this season, I would say is pretty likely at this point. But now for the finale, which ends up starting with a flashback sequence that shows us the Cody blindside once again, that acts as both a recap, but also gives us more context on the vote, with us getting to see Cody giving Jesse back the idol and setting him up as the guy in the beat here. And despite the talk of Jesse getting a coronation edit at this point, I really just didn't believe it. I really didn't believe that they would make the winner this obvious, especially with the amount of foreshadowing to his potential downfall across this season. Though this does add suspense to this episode, with it setting up the will he, won't he, though with Jesse's constant talk about his heightened threat level after pulling off the Cody move, and him explicitly mentioning that no one is going to take him to the end, I did feel like it was pretty clear that he wasn't going to win here. But here we do get the return of the pointless twist of them sending them to a new beach for the last few days, and also having them do a word scramble for a clue to an advantage to immunity challenge. And again, all this just feels like a waste of time here, again feeling like they just did it to fill out time in the finale, thinking that there wouldn't be enough content considering they're only there for one day before the vote off. But the scramble for the vote here is pretty fun, where it ends up being between Carla and Owen finds the tree first, but Carla gets to the advantage first, leading to a pissed Owen talking about how he is the Charlie Brown once again, and already completely counteracting Owen's game recap from the beginning of the episode, and him talking about how he needed to play a perfect game at the end here to win. So despite Owen being on an upward trajectory here, it definitely felt like this was the last straw for his winning chances. Though despite Carla's advantage here, we do see Owen win the immunity challenge, which has a reward component to it that he takes Cassidy along. Which is where we do finally learn that there is a Cassidy-Owen-Gabler final 3 deal that was clearly going to be the final 3 at this point. Where despite Gabler's strong storyline across this season, we do instantly hear them talk about Gabler being a GOAT, and both Cassidy and Owen being confident in that, which I will be honest, I took at face value at this point, and thought his declaration of how he wins in that scenario seeming ridiculous, but now looking back on it, it does perfectly fit into his theme of hiding in plain sight. Though because of this, I was convinced that Cassidy was going to win at this point, who instantly pops off in this episode, with her outlining her game in a way that felt like it was clearly going to set up her final tribal, talking about being on the right side of every vote, though not making the flashy moves, which she said would be her strategy all the way back in the premiere. But also we do return to a rivalry with Carla here, and where she is talking about needing to get her out, which ends up leading to strong content for her here in the lead up to the vote, with her getting the credit for keeping the vote on Carla despite Owen's thoughts about wanting to take out Jesse instead. Continuing on this storyline of Cassidy taking out whoever ends up coming for her, and we do get this conversation between Cassidy and Carla, with Carla coming off as extremely condescending and talking about how she didn't make any moves on this season and won't vote for her at the end, which here comes off as extremely negative content for Carla on her way out, and does portray Cassidy in a more positive light, as it makes it seem like she's going to prove her wrong, when in reality it turns out that this was actually her jury perception. But afterwards, we do see Carla and Jesse talking about regrouping to take out Cassidy, with them being the 2 biggest threats, and Jesse instantly seems to be on board, as he should. I mean, at this point, I do think Jesse wins against anybody, but without an ally like Cody, he is very vulnerable here at the Final 4, and keeping around Carla as a shield for him is the optimal move here, though the problem is finding a way to keep her around, where he obviously has his idol that can keep him safe, though Carla is already the consensus boot, meaning that he would have to put a lot of trust into her if he were to save her, as obviously playing his idol on her would still leave him vulnerable. And almost instantly, we do see Carla not be on board with this plan and still want Jesse out, which really just secured that she was going to go home here from an edit perspective, though I don't think there was really a way for her to get through this outside of just Jesse playing the idol on her, which just seemed extremely unlikely, though we do get a fun tribal, the first live tribal in a while of us seeing Jesse pull out his idol, which does lead to some fun reactions, particularly from Janine, but this leads to Jesse Jessie and Carla talking on the side, though again, it did feel like too big of a risk for Jesse to actually play his idol on her, and he doesn't here, which, to be fair, in this position, Carla does end up voting for him anyway, meaning that he would have been taken out by his own idol if he did make that move. But again, we do lose Carla here, who got a bit of a confusing edit, with it being obviously extremely positive early on, though it just had such a negative trajectory by the end here, where again, she was the Edgic frontrunner for a lot of the season, but by the finale here, I had her as the least likely person to win, and I will say that despite Carla seeming to have a lot of win equity towards the end of the game here, and got very close to the end, I actually found a lot of Carla's game here, particularly in the post-merge, to be extremely underwhelming. Now, I think she played well on her original Coco tribe, with her playing the middle, though even then I think she makes some questionable moves, particularly the Geo vote, but she just ends up having so little agency after the merge. Well, yes, she does have her Coco alliance, but even then we're being shown that she doesn't have much power within that group, not really getting her way, and I do think her letting go of James as early as she did was really detrimental to her game, where by the time the Noelle boot, she's really just scraping by, with her days being numbered. So overall, I just found her game to be really underwhelming, but she still ends up being a major presence on this season, despite not being looked at as super likable towards the last few episodes. Well, that takes us to the final 4 round, where again, it's all about Jesse, where having Carla out here pretty much dooms Jesse in the game, with him now needing to win immunity, something he hadn't done before and never came particularly close. And while yes, he did also have the fire making challenge as a backup, we also had 2 very strong fire makers here in Gabler and Owen, and with the entire group against him, I really felt like the only way he would survive here is through winning immunity. Like, I never felt like there was really a chance that Jesse was going to get out of this, and to me this does radically recontextualize the Cody blindside here, where again it is an extremely impressive move, but without the ability to win either of the challenges here in this final round, it ends up leaving him with pretty much no room to maneuver here, where we do see Cassie winning final immunity, which I felt like was pretty obvious that was going to happen, but again, her entire decision-making process here is to ensure that Jesse loses, where we do see Jesse trying to get Cassie to throw herself in, clearly being the worst firemaker of the 3, though she doesn't take the bait here, which ends up being used against her later on, of her not willing to make the move here, though I really just feel like that's ridiculous. And I feel like this is a standard that was obviously set by Chris Underwood, but one that shouldn't be a necessity to end up proving your game, particularly if you're not someone coming back from the edge. But instead here we do get the choice between sending in Owen or Gabler, both of which want to go in to make a show of it to the jury, taking out the biggest threat in the game. But really, to me, I didn't feel like this choice really mattered, as either way I was expecting both Gabler and Owen to beat Jesse here, and despite Cassie talking about how she's worried about Gabler not being strong enough to take on Jesse in fire, from her perspective, it didn't seem like there was any true downside in picking Gabler here, with her assuming that he wouldn't be able to win at the end, and also not wanting to give Owen any momentum, which based on the information that she has, I do think she makes the correct choice here. However, in retrospect, this is clearly an indication of her lack of awareness in the game, and her underestimating Gabler's win equity, which I do think ends up being a bad look for her for the jury. And here we do see Gabler just demolish Jesse in firemaking, no real suspense in the actual challenge itself, with Gabler breaking the record set by Chris Underwood for fastest to make fire, though again this challenge does end up having a lot of emotional weight to it. I mean, first off in the fact that this is the first time we do learn about Gabler's plans for what he's doing with the money, where he plans on donating it to a charity for veterans, which, I mean, good on him. I mean, I wouldn't do that. But this ends up being very curious, positive content for him that's just sprung up on us in the finale, which did make me think that Gabler actually wasn't going to win, as why wouldn't we hear about this earlier if this was the case? Though obviously its use here is to add stakes to this final challenge for Gabler, now giving us the reason for why he's playing. While for Jesse, we obviously see him being overwhelmed with emotion even before the challenge, seeming to know that the cards are stacked against him, and knowing that he's so close to winning the game here, and we do get this really dramatic exit for him, probably being the most emotional we've ever seen a final juror be at their elimination. But this ends up being a great farewell to Jesse, certainly the player of the season, and the show clearly highlighted that along the way. But again, I always felt like this was a decoy winner edit, initially feeling like he was going to be booted in the mid-merge phase of the game, though obviously at the point where his edit started to pick up towards the mid-merge, he instead starts looking like the final boss that the event eventual winner is going to take down, ending up being in this Rick Devens style position of openly being the biggest threat by the end of the game. But again, I do think his gameplay here was extremely impressive, controlling the action for most of the post-merge phase of the game, also being brilliantly positioned throughout the entire game. I mean, he seemed to be a master at threat management to where, despite him calling a lot of the shots, no one seemed to recognize the fact that he was doing so until the Cody blindside, which again in itself I do think is a very impressive move, one that's insane to see be pulled off, though at the same time did counteract all the masterful work he had done previously to manage his threat level, where again he reached that point in the game with still no one seeming to target him. I do feel like up to the final 6, he played a near perfect game, one that if he had won from that point forward, while maintaining a majority, he would have been alongside the all-time greats, probably being alongside Earl Cole for me in my winner ranking, which puts him as a top 5 winner of all time, though again, he didn't make it, and his move to take out Cody backfired on him. Though through that, he still ends up being one of the best final jurors in the history of the show. I mean, probably not quite up to the level of those screwed over by a twist, but probably at the top of those that weren't. I mean, Jesse really ends up playing a masterful game up until the final 6, though at that point, he made a calculated risk that simply just didn't pay off, which ends up being a game-ending move for him, but doesn't stop him from being one of the best players we've seen in a while. So that, we're now at the final 3, where we get the typical confessionals of the players reminiscing over their games, though here we do hear from the jury as well, which I've always liked when they include these, though this does actually become my first instant of doubt in Cassidy's win here, where Jessie in particular didn't seem to be particularly high on her when talking about her game, while Cody also seemed to be extremely high of Gabler, and with them two seeming to be very influential figures on the jury, that was the first time I started to have some doubt in Cassidy's win. Though really the entire jury philosophy here seemed to put a lot of importance on the final tribal performances, similarly to what we saw in 42, to where it seemed like a lot of the jury came in undecided and did make their decision based on how final tribal went, which I actually don't like, as it really just simplifies the game to who can tell the best story at the tail end of it, feeling like Final Tribal itself is its own challenge that will solely determine the winner over it being a culmination of the game up to that point, as it was initially intended to be, though at the same time, the point of the game is still to get the votes from the jury, and if that is what the jury is looking for, then that's the way it is. And to be fair, I think a major aspect of that is the fact that these finalists were so evenly matched. I mean, obviously if Jesse got to the end, he would have won anyway, no matter how he performed. So I do think in seasons like this in 42, where Final Tribal seemed to have more importance, I do think it largely stems from the fact that none of these players were looked at as frontrunners from earlier on, but Final Tribal here ends up being a pretty mundane affair to me. Just in line with a lot of recent Final Tribals, with them being extremely game body, but not really having a particular moment of note. Though here, I did feel like Owen in particular had a pretty underwhelming Final Tribal. While he did come off as pretty aware of his game and very honest to the jury about his game, and how little control he had and how the game played out, I still feel like he missed out on something that is really a necessity on making this style of play really effective, and that is to have emotion. Most of his performance came off as extremely stilted to me, which again counteracts the entire premise of his plea. His entire basis of his plea is that he's trying to pull on people's emotions to want to root for the underdog, so I just feel like his performance as a whole ends up being largely lacking, though I did feel like both Gabler and Cassidy performed well here, though both had some minor holes in their performance. Gabler did a very effective job at highlighting his hiding at plain sight strategy, articulating his game as one that was based around trust and relationships, and I had direct examples to point that out. He had the jury laughing with his use of the Alec Gabler nickname, which at the time I was thinking they were laughing at him. Though again, in retrospect, another sign that the jury was definitely on his side. But again, all this ends up being really effective. Though I didn't like a couple of his answers, with him being particularly hung up on talking about things that happened in the pre-merge, which most of the people there weren't there for, and also his unwillingness to answer the question of if he planned on cutting Cody and Jesse by the end of it, which it seemed like that was kind of ignored, but again, based on his response, he never said he would have. But again, this is all while Cassidy's performance felt pretty baseline propping up her ability to stay in the majority and not getting blindsided along the entire season, while also attempting to appeal to the individual jury members. The one glaring hole here, though, is a major one and comes at the tail end of Final Tribal here, where we do see her trying to take credit for the Ryan move in a situation where Cody and Jesse end up rebutting that, revealing to her that it was actually a move made by them and Gabler, being the moment that they formed the Ride or Die Alliance, which in itself seemed to have a lot more importance in the game than was ever displayed on the show, as it was constantly talked about Final Tribal here. Overall, I mean, this felt like an extremely bad look for Cassidy here, showing her as unaware of her game once again, while also propping up Gabler for getting one over on her, which at this point, this is where I was truly taken aback, now fully thinking that there was a chance that Gabler might pull this off. And I will say, I did feel like this was a curious choice anyway. Like, why is Cassie saying the Ryan move when she can very clearly say the Carla move? With Carla even being a bigger target to prop up there than Ryan, and with her also having the ability to take more clear credit for that move. So I did feel like overall this was just a bad answer, but again, coming into the vote, I was expecting this to be a 5-3 vote. I was expecting Gabler to get the votes of Ryan, Cody, and Jesse, though at the moment where we see Carla vote for Gabler here, again, I was stunned. Again, at this point, it did seem like it was leaning towards Gabler, and when we see it turns out to be a 7-1 vote here, with Cassidy only getting James, and even Cassidy and Owen seeming to be shocked at this result. Again, most people seem to be upset. However, I just audibly laughed when these votes started coming in, where, again, I've talked about that in the review, that Gabler's had the most consistent storyline of the season, though even I underestimated his actual win ability. I generally didn't think that the jury would be willing to give him the win here, though it is still an outcome that I saw as very probable coming into this episode, with Cass and Gabler essentially being tied, who I thought was the most likely to win coming into the finale, though the finale itself did feel very much focused on Cassidy, and it felt like it was hers to lose here, which ends up adding to this really fun train wrecking nature to this season, ending the season in a really memorable way that I do think will probably just boon the season as it goes along. Now, I guess I should also mention the fact that there was also still the after show, which still sucks. Though I did feel like we got a couple nice personal moments here, from Gabler revealing the fact that he's donating the prize money to charity, and we get the typical emotional content from Carla and Jesse. Though I did feel like we really lacked on true game talk here, particularly in how the jury was thinking, where I do still leave this not fully sure on why exactly the jury decided to back Gabler here, which I will say is the biggest criticism of the edit for me, in that while yes, thematically the storylines for both Cassie and Gabler were there, I feel like we never truly saw the gameplay to back up their potential winning trajectories, which I do think left a lot of people confused over why people thought people like Cassidy and Gabler could potentially win the game. By the way, I mean, obviously this video is already extremely long, so let's start to wind it down by talking about the final three, starting off with Owen, who ends up being a really likable presence here, being a super fan that just had everything not go his way while out there, being this perpetual underdog figure that made him very rootable here, though I will say I do think Owen played a largely lackluster game, where up to the final 6 round, I was prepared to have Owen near the bottom of my player ranking. Though I do think he recovered a bit towards the end here, finding a final 3 alliance, and was able to stay in the majority at the tail end of the game, though I do wonder if he had any true win equity at all, to where his game seemed to clearly be behind the likes of Cassidy and Gabler, and him not really having a leg to stand on in Final Tribal. So I really don't know if he could have gotten the votes together, though considering the fact that he was almost never in the majority until the tail end of the game, the fact that he was able to scrape his way through is impressive to a degree, though obviously not the type of game that I would personally vote for. Now let's talk about the runner-up in Cassidy, who I am shocked ends up being the runner-up here. I fully expected her to either be the winner or the first boot in the finale. And for her to lose a jury vote here feels very jarring, considering her storyline was based around how intentionally she was playing from behind the scenes, and seemed to be portrayed in a way that was going to lead up to that game being rewarded. Now I will say, in retrospect, there were many points where this theme were undercut, where despite her playing behind the scenes, she was constantly being targeted. And that in itself, I do think, undercuts the theme, which is a criticism I've always seen, but never felt like it was done in a direct way to actually undercut her edit. Now, again, like, I understand why she ends up losing the game here. However, I do feel like her edit is just strange for that of a runner-up. Again, the show never really focuses on why she ends up losing the game. But as a player, I do think Cassidy is a solid all-around player. I mean, while she didn't dictate any votes, she was able to maintain her position in the majority for the entire game. Though, again, at points, she was more so a tag-along, but still, I do feel like my first inclination on who to vote for would have been to vote for Cassidy. Though I do think in retrospect, I do think Cassidy and Gabler are actually extremely close. While I do think Cassidy is for sure the better player in the grand scheme of Survivor, I think the games that they played here are actually pretty similar. With the big knock for Cassidy to me being that she was pointed out as being a threat more often, which shows a lack of threat management, though at the same time shows skill in the fact that she was able to overcome that. I feel like Cassidy played a very solid game here, a pretty standard middle tier game of Survivor, though one that demonstrates a lack of awareness, particularly in how she handled Gabler, which ends up harming how she was perceived, which I do think was a major aspect of why she ends up losing at the end here. And with that, now let's talk about the winner of the season in Gabler. And again, how did we get here? Just really surreal to think of Gabler as a Survivor winner, especially with this kookier edit earlier on in the season. Though again, as I pointed out, I mean, every time he seemed to get negative content, it seemed to be counteracted by a bit of positive content to back him up. Again, for me, Gabler's edit is not one that I'm shocked that it ends up leading to a win. Again, he had the most consistent storyline of the Endgamers, a storyline that never felt like he was counteracted throughout the entire season, which I think at this point is very clearly a big tell in a modern winner edit. But again, it just felt so unlikely that someone like Gabler would win. I mean, he is an incredible character, having a number of fun moments across the season, and his rivalry with Ellie ends up being one of the most entertaining aspects of the early portions of the season. But beyond that, I do think he still played a solid game. While his pre-merge game was definitely lacking, he was still able to maintain Sammy's loyalty and still was looped in on what was going on. In a post-merge, he did exactly what he said he was going to do. I mean, he hid in plain sight. He came off as such a non-threat despite the fact that he was riding the middle, having a wide number of options moving forward but still being looked at as a GOAT. That disarmed the people around him into thinking that they could beat him. Though in actuality, he had these connections that he built to allow him to have a basis to sell his game at Final Tribal, coming off as self-aware during Final Tribal. Again, for me, my assessment of his game is not that far from where I would put Cassidy. I do think he also played a middle tier game of Survivor, being a middle tier winner of the show for me, playing the swing position very well. Though at the same time, obviously I do criticize him for not having much control in how the game actually played out and really just following the lead of the bigger players out there, though he still maintained a pretty strong position in the game despite that, while also having the respect from the jury to win the game outright, not needing to bank on a jury voting against his peers, which ends up elevating him above the bottom tier of winners for me. But with that, I mean, that is the entire season of Survivor 43, a very strange season, feeling very baseline for a lot of it, with it containing some likable characters, but still seeming to lack on the gameplay front until the very end of the season. Though I still personally found this season to be a really fun ride, particularly due to the uncertainty of where the season was going, with the edit truly tricking me at points, which is something that rarely happens in modern Survivor. Though at the same time, I do have a lot of criticisms for this season, many of them coming from just the general format of this new era, but even beyond that, I do feel like there were a lot of questionable editing decisions that were made on this season, with a lot of things going unexplained on the show, and a lot of the plot threads just seeming to go nowhere. But as I said earlier, this season does still largely fit with 41 and 42 in my overall opinions of it, with it kind of feeling like a mixture of the two. I mean, I would probably put this season around the same spot in my season rankings, which I'll be honest, I haven't fully decided on where that is yet, though I would assume it's relatively close to the middle of the list, where despite my issues with this season, it still ends up having a very strong cast, some notable gameplay moments at the very end, and a really unpredictable outcome, which ends up elevating this season. But with that, those are my thoughts on Survivor 43, my longest Survivor US review yet. But like my other reviews, I'll be following this up with a player ranking as well in my next few videos, so stay tuned for that. We are also winding down on the year of 2022, where the final video of the year will be a ranking on every reality TV season I've watched from this year, which this will obviously be included in that, so watch out for that as well. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.